What if the real history of the United States wasn't written in textbooks, but buried under blood, lies, and silence? This isn't the patriotic myth. This is the unfiltered truth. From secret experiments to state-sanctioned slaughter, these are the moments America hopes you'll forget. 101 facts, each darker than the last, each a crack in the stars and stripes. You think you know history? Think again. Welcome to the 101 darkest facts in U.S. history. Let's dig. The Sand Creek Massacre, 1864. It began with a promise, a white flag raised over a sleepy village of Cheyenne and Arapaho families, fluttering in the Colorado dawn. They thought they were safe. They had been assured peace. What followed was not war. It was slaughter. Colonel John Chivington led a force of 700 volunteer soldiers to Sand Creek under the banner of civilizing the frontier. What they brought instead was butchery. They descended at sunrise, firing indiscriminately into the camp. The men weren't armed. The women clutched children. The old couldn't even run. But that didn't stop the bullets, the bayonets, or the mutilation. Genitals were cut from bodies. Skulls were crushed. And in the carnage, over 150 Native Americans were reduced to trophies and unmarked graves. Chivington would later call it a victory. The press called it a triumph, but others, soldiers who witnessed it and senators back in Washington, saw the horror for what it was. It was hard to see little children on their knees have their brains beat out by men professing to be civilized, testified one officer. A congressional investigation confirmed the atrocities, yet no one was punished. Chivington resigned. The survivors were left to bury their kin and their faith in American justice. The Sand Creek Massacre wasn't just a tragedy. It was a blueprint. A lesson written in blood that Native lives were expendable and their peace treaties, paper illusions. The massacre burned itself into the collective memory of indigenous communities and whispered a grim forecast. This wasn't the end. It was the opening act. And if you think watching a nation massacre its own promises was unsettling, wait until it starts experimenting on its own people for science. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, 1932-1972. Imagine walking into a clinic, trusting the man in the white coat. He says you're getting treated. You nod. You roll up your sleeve. What you don't know is he's lying. For 40 years, the U.S. Public Health Service ran an experiment so grotesque it reads like fiction. They recruited 600 poor African American men in Alabama, 399 of whom had syphilis. They were never told their diagnosis. Instead, they were promised free health care, special treatment, and hot meals. The truth? They were being observed like lab rats, left untreated so doctors could study the long-term effects of the disease. Even when penicillin became the accepted cure in the 1940s, it was withheld. Men went blind. They lost their minds. They died. Their wives were infected. Their children were born with congenital syphilis, all while researchers took notes. It wasn't a rogue operation. It was federally sanctioned, funded, reviewed, approved. This wasn't science. It was racialized necromancy, a bureaucratic slow-motion execution. For decades, nothing stopped it. Not whistleblowers, not the local black community's suspicions, not even the dead piling up. The experiment only ended when a former employee leaked the details to the press in 1972. The public outcry was seismic. Congressional hearings followed. There were apologies, payouts, reforms, but no jail time, no criminal charges, just regret, PR damage control, and a few commemorative plaques. The Tuskegee experiment is why so many still mistrust doctors. It's why phrases like informed consent exist. It's a stain on the white coat of American medicine, and a reminder. Sometimes the worst wounds come from a clipboard and a quiet nod. And yet, even this horror wasn't conducted in isolation. In fact, paranoia and power were brewing something even more sweeping, something that would redefine enemy of the state. The Palmer Raids, 1919-1920. In the years after World War I, America was afraid of bombs, of Bolsheviks, of anarchists with funny accents and unpronounceable names. And fear, pure, sticky fear, has a way of turning a democracy into a police state. Enter Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, a man with ambition, a mustache, and a deep fear of radicals. After a series of bombings shook the nation, Palmer declared a crusade against subversion. What followed was a whirlwind of mass arrests, secret surveillance, and constitutional bonfires. In one night, over 10,000 suspected communists were seized in coordinated raids. Doors were kicked in. Families dragged from their beds. Many had done nothing more than attend a meeting or read the wrong newspaper. Warrants were optional. Trials were rare. Due process was left gasping in a jail cell. Men were held for weeks without charges, interrogated, beaten, deported. The prisons overflowed with immigrants, union organizers, and anyone who had dared question the government's narrative. The Red Scare wasn't just a metaphor. It was a nationwide spasm of panic weaponized by politics. And Palmer? He saw himself as a savior, a presidential hopeful. But the raids began to crack under scrutiny. The evidence was flimsy. The courts pushed back. Public opinion soured. His political career fizzled, but the machinery of paranoia kept grinding. The template had been set. Fear equals power. Because once the state learns it can break you without reason, it rarely forgets how. The Palmer raids didn't end the threat of communism. They just redefined what counted as treason. And if you think orchestrating fear from the top was bold, wait until the government starts sterilizing people in the name of progress. The eugenics movement, progress, has a dark twin. It wears the lab coat of the well-educated, speaks in the language of fitness, and smiles while erasing your humanity. In early 20th century America, that twin was called eugenics. It wasn't fringe. It wasn't secret. It was mainstream, embraced by politicians, scientists, philanthropists, and college professors. The logic was chilling in its simplicity. Human stock could be improved through selective breeding, which meant some people, those deemed unfit, needed to stop reproducing. And so began one of the most sustained, state-sanctioned campaigns of involuntary sterilization in modern history. More than 30 states passed laws allowing forced sterilizations. Over 60,000 Americans were subjected to the procedure, often without informed consent. Who qualified? The poor, the mentally ill, people of color, women labeled promiscuous, immigrants who spoke the wrong language or looked the wrong way. Children as young as 10 were mutilated under the guise of science. And this wasn't whispered in the shadows. It was celebrated. State fairs had fitter family contests. Textbooks preached the gospel of racial purity. Even the U.S. Supreme Court backed it. In 1927, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote in the infamous Buck v. Bell decision, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough. The legacy?" Some of those laws stayed on the books into the 21st century. Victims have only recently begun to receive acknowledgement, let alone compensation. And perhaps most disturbing of all, America's eugenics movement directly inspired Nazi Germany's racial hygiene policies. Science, unmoored from ethics, becomes a scalpel in the hands of ideology. And when the government claims the right to decide who deserves to exist, it's not just dangerous, it's a prelude. Next came something even darker. Hidden behind agency logos and redacted memos, it was science fiction made real. Welcome to the lab, MK Ultra. MK Ultra, 1950s and 1970s. There was a time when the CIA feared the communists could control minds. Naturally, their response was to try and do it first. MK Ultra wasn't a theory. It was a classified umbrella of mind control experiments run by the CIA during the Cold War. Its goal? To break the human psyche and rebuild it. To erase memories, plant ideas, and manufacture obedience. And it wasn't carried out in enemy territory. It happened in American hospitals, universities, and military bases. The agency used LSD like a kid uses glitter. sprinkled it on everyone and everything. Doses were slipped into drinks without consent. Homeless people were dosed and watched like lab rats. Prisoners were subjected to psychological torture. One man, Dr. Frank Olson, a government scientist, was drugged without his knowledge, spiraled into psychosis, and mysteriously fell from a hotel window. The official story was taking their own life. Decades later, the evidence smelled more like murder. The CIA also experimented with electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, hypnosis, and isolation chambers, all in secret, all without oversight. The files were extensive until they weren't. In 1973, amid rising scrutiny, the CIA destroyed most of the documentation. What remains is a shredded outline of what might have been one of the largest peacetime violations of human rights in U.S. history. The irony? It didn't even work. No magic switch for the human brain was found. No super spy assassins were created. Just ruined lives and a growing file on how far a government would go when gripped by fear and absolute secrecy. MKUltra wasn't about protecting America, it was about controlling it, and the fallout continues. To this day, it's a synonym for mistrust, conspiracy, and the quiet horror of what happens when no one's watching the watchers. And speaking of forced obedience and the brutal march of government will. Next, we go back in time to a trail paved in blood and tears. The Trail of Tears, 1830s. It didn't start with a war. It started with paperwork. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act passed. Politicians called it progress. Settlers called it opportunity. The Cherokee called it betrayal, because what followed was the state-sanctioned eviction of entire Native nations from their ancestral homelands, displacement at gunpoint, under the thin veneer of law. The Trail of Tears refers to the forced relocation of the Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations from the southeastern United States to Indian Territory, now Oklahoma. Thousands were marched west under military escort. They were given little food, inadequate clothing, and no mercy. Entire communities walked hundreds of miles through brutal winters and disease-choked camps. For the Cherokee alone, the death toll reached approximately 4,000, about a quarter of their entire population. And the cruel irony? They had tried to adapt. They had built schools, adopted constitutions, even held slaves. They took their legal case all the way to the Supreme Court and won. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled in their favor. President Andrew Jackson's response? He ignored it. John Marshall has made his decision, he reportedly sneered. Now let him enforce it. The soldiers who rounded them up often came at night. People were dragged from homes, shackled, and herded into stockades like livestock. Along the trail, mothers buried infants in shallow roadside graves. Elders collapsed from hunger. The rivers ran with grief. It was ethnic cleansing with legislative cover. It was land theft, wearing a judge's robe. And it wasn't the last. It was just the prototype. Because if the Trail of Tears taught America anything, it was that removal works. Silence the voices. Take the land. Rewrite the maps. But some voices fought back, with rifles, with picket lines, and with the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, someone was listening. The Ludlow Massacre, 1914. The miners at Ludlow were asking for air, literal air. Their children were suffocating in coal dust. Their lungs blackened before puberty. But instead of clean air and fair pay, they got bullets and fire. In 1914, in the hills of southern Colorado, thousands of coal miners, mostly immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, went on strike against the powerful Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, owned by the Rockefeller family. They demanded better wages, safer conditions, and an end to company domination over their lives. In response, they were evicted from their company-owned homes and forced into makeshift tent colonies. One such camp was Ludlow. On April 20th, state militia and company guards surrounded it. What followed was a coordinated assault. Machine guns fired into the tents. Soldiers set fire to the camp. People fled. Some into cellars dug beneath their tents. That was a fatal mistake. When the smoke cleared, 19 were dead, including 11 children and 2 women who had hidden in a pit to escape the gunfire, only to suffocate when the tents above were torched. The public was outraged. The massacre became a symbol of corporate brutality and the inhumanity of unchecked industrial power. The tent city was reduced to ash, but the images, the charred toys, the small bodies pulled from smoldering ground, ignited national sympathy. Even President Woodrow Wilson was forced to acknowledge it, though no real justice followed. The Rockefellers spun it as necessary. The newspapers called it industrial warfare. The workers called it what it was, murder. And as the smoke from Ludlow drifted into history, America was reminded that even peaceful protests can be met with organized, merciless violence, especially when profits are on the line. The next few decades wouldn't slow down the bloodshed. They'd add presidents to the body count. The assassinations of Abraham Lincoln, James A. Garfield, William McKinley, and John F. Kennedy. 4 presidents, 4 assassins, 4 violent public reckonings with the soul of American leadership. These weren't quiet exits or political fades. These were explosions, chaotic, shocking, and steeped in the tensions of their times. It began with Abraham Lincoln in 1865. Fresh from the Civil War's end, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater. He never left. John Wilkes Booth, an actor and Confederate sympathizer, crept into his box and shot him in the head. Booth thought he'd save the South. Instead, he cemented Lincoln as a martyr and unleashed a nationwide manhunt soaked in vengeance. Next came James A. Garfield in 1881. Barely months into his presidency, Garfield was shot by Charles Guiteau, a deranged office seeker who believed he was owed a diplomatic post. Garfield lingered for weeks as doctors probed his wound with unsterilized fingers. He didn't die from the bullet. He died from the infection. Then in 1901, it was William McKinley. He was shaking hands at a public exposition in Buffalo when anarchist Leon Czolgosz stepped forward and fired. McKinley died of gangrene 8 days later. His death ushered in the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt and solidified the fear that even progress and prosperity couldn't armor a leader against fanaticism. And finally, John F. Kennedy in 1963. Dallas, a motorcade, a rifle from the 6th floor. Lee Harvey Oswald's shots fractured not just Kennedy's skull, but the American psyche. Grainy footage from the Zapruder film became the eternal loop of a nation's innocence bleeding out on the back seat of a convertible. Each assassination wasn't just a loss, it was a symptom of polarization, of radicalism, of the deep and volatile fractures under the surface of democracy. Power in America has never come without a crosshair. But sometimes it's not presidents who burn, it's the prisoners. Because a spark behind bars can ignite a fire no one can control. The Attica Prison Uprising, 1971. Attica was a powder keg. Decades of abuse, racism, and inhumane conditions sat like dry kindlings inside the high walls of the maximum security prison in upstate New York. On September 9, 1971, someone lit the match. It started with a fight. Then doors were broken. Guards were overpowered. And suddenly, 1,300 inmates controlled most of the prison. But this wasn't chaos for chaos's sake. It was an uprising with demands. Better living conditions, medical treatment, fair visitation rights, an end to brutal beatings. The inmates negotiated. They brought in observers, including journalists, lawyers, even activists. They wanted to talk. Governor Nelson Rockefeller didn't. On the morning of September 13th, after 5 days of tension, troopers stormed the prison. Helicopters dropped tear gas. State police opened fire. Over 2,000 rounds were shot in 15 minutes. When the dust settled, 43 people were dead, 10 of them hostages. Some of the dead had their hands in the air when they were shot. The official narrative blamed inmates for the hostages' deaths. But autopsies told the truth. All had been killed by state gunfire. What followed was a cover-up. Authorities claimed order had been restored. But what they restored was silence, enforced by batons and isolation. Inmates were stripped, beaten, and tortured. Their voices were dismissed. Their humanity erased. The Attica uprising was not about a riot. It was about being heard, about demanding dignity in a place designed to deny it. The state's response was swift and brutal. The message was clear. Disobedience, even when organized, would be met with overwhelming force. But Attica didn't disappear. It became a rallying cry, a wound that never fully healed. Proof that even behind walls, injustice festers, and sometimes it explodes. And in the next city over, just a decade later, that explosion would come from the sky. Not from inmates, but from the police. The Move bombing, 1985, Philadelphia, May 13th, 1985, the day an American city bombed itself. The target? A row house at 6221 Osage Avenue, occupied by members of Move, a black liberation and back-to-nature group known for its confrontational stance toward police and local government. The group had clashed with authorities before, loudspeakers blasting political rants, tensions over sanitation, firearms, and an earlier fatal standoff in 1978. But what happened on this day was beyond escalation. It was annihilation. After hours of gunfire exchanged between police and Move members barricaded inside the house, authorities took it further. A helicopter dropped 2 satchel bombs, yes, bombs, on the rooftop. The explosives ignited a blaze. Firefighters were ordered to let it burn. And burn it did. The fire consumed the Move house and quickly spread to surrounding homes. The result was a war zone. 61 houses were destroyed. 11 people in the Move house died, including 5 children. The fire raged for hours, unchecked. Neighbors watched their lives incinerate from sidewalks as police created a perimeter. The official justification? Public safety. The real outcome? A neighborhood reduced to rubble and a death toll that included children the police had known were inside. An investigation followed, but no officials faced criminal charges. The city eventually paid civil damages, but the scars, both physical and political, never healed. Osage Avenue was rebuilt, poorly and quickly. Residents never returned in the same numbers. And the Move bombing became a symbol of government overreach, of racialized violence, and of a system that sometimes treats neighborhoods as combat zones. The state dropped fire from the sky. The world watched. And in the ashes, one truth stood out. This wasn't a one-off. It was part of a pattern. And sometimes, it doesn't take a bomb. It takes a mob. The Tulsa Race Massacre, 1921. It was known as Black Wall Street, Greenwood, Tulsa, Oklahoma. A thriving black community. Doctors, lawyers, business owners. A place that proved success could be black, loud, and unapologetically excellent. That was the problem. On May 31st, 1921, it began with a rumor that a young black man had assaulted a white woman in an elevator. He hadn't, but that didn't matter. By nightfall, white mobs, armed and deputized, descended on Greenwood. What followed was one of the most violent episodes of racial terrorism in American history. Homes were looted and torched. Businesses were burned to the ground. Black residents were shot in the streets. Some were dragged behind cars. Others were herded into detention centers. Airplanes, yes, private aircraft, dropped incendiaries. For over 18 hours, Greenwood was under siege. By the time the smoke cleared, over 1,000 homes and businesses were gone. As many as 300 people were dead. Thousands more were left homeless. No one was held accountable. Insurance companies refused to pay out claims because the destruction was labeled a riot. The city and state looked the other way. For decades, it was omitted from textbooks, silenced in public discourse, scrubbed from the American memory. It wasn't just an act of violence. It was a coordinated erasure, a genocide of prosperity, and it served as a warning. Black success in America would not be tolerated if it existed outside white control. Greenwood burned. Its people were buried in mass graves. And history tried to bury them too. But memory has a way of clawing back. The massacre is no longer hidden, but the pain, still very much alive. And if that sounds like ancient history, think again. Because just 50 years later, students were gunned down for daring to raise their voices. The Kent State shootings, 1970. It was spring. College campuses buzzed with protest. Nixon had just announced the invasion of Cambodia, and the Vietnam War, already blood-soaked, was about to expand. At Kent State University, the outrage wasn't just ideological, it was generational. The youth were done being cannon fodder. On May 4th, 1970, students gathered in the Commons. Some threw rocks, some chanted, some just watched. The Ohio National Guard was called in. They wore gas masks. They carried loaded rifles. Tension simmered. Then, without warning, they opened fire. 13 seconds, 67 bullets, 4 students dead, 9 wounded. Some weren't even part of the protest. One girl was walking to class. One boy had his hands in his pockets. All were unarmed. All were gunned down by their own government in broad daylight on a college campus. The nation recoiled. Photos of a teenage girl screaming over a dead body hit every front page. The country split. Some mourned. Others said the students had it coming. Nixon's press secretary called it necessary. Protest erupted in over 450 campuses nationwide. The divide was clear: order versus outrage. But the cost? Human lives, American lives. No guardsmen were convicted. No justice followed. Only scars, on the ground, in the community, and across the country. The Kent State shootings weren't just about war. They were about voice, about what happens when citizens try to speak. And the state answers with bullets. The tragedy echoed into the future. And if you thought the state learned restraint, think again. Because in the shadows of the nation's capital, another army of forgotten heroes was about to be crushed under its own flag. The Bonus Army March, 1932. They came with nothing but their uniforms and hope. World War I veterans, unemployed and desperate during the Great Depression, marched on Washington in the summer of 1932. They weren't asking for a handout. They were demanding what was already promised: a bonus payment for their military service scheduled for 1945, but needed now. They were hungry. Their families were starving. So they built a shanty town on the banks of the Anacostia River and called it home. Over 40,000 strong, including women and children, the Bonus Army was peaceful but persistent. They held parades, made speeches, petitioned Congress. The House passed a bill to release the funds early, but the Senate rejected it. Still, the veterans stayed. They believed in their country, enough to sleep in tents in the shadow of the Capitol. The government's response? Tanks. President Herbert Hoover ordered the military to remove them. Enter General Douglas MacArthur, with a young Major Dwight D. Eisenhower and a future general named George Patton. On July 28th, U.S. troops, with fixed bayonets and tear gas, stormed the encampment. They burned the tents, trampled the protests. One baby died from gas exposure. Hundreds were injured. And the very soldiers who had fought for America were beaten back by its own military. The optics were catastrophic. Americans watched in horror as the government turned its guns on its veterans. The attack didn't just destroy a camp, it shattered trust. Hoover's reputation never recovered, and the image of soldiers attacking their own was seared into the national consciousness. The Bonus Army didn't win their money that year, but they did win something bigger: a warning, a sign that patriotism isn't always rewarded, and that the flag doesn't always wave for the people who fought to defend it. And as you'll see next, sometimes the enemy doesn't come in uniform. It hides in newsrooms and headlines. Operation Mockingbird. What if the evening news wasn't news at all? What if the trusted anchors, the op-eds, The wire reports, all of it, were just whispers from Langley. Welcome to Operation Mockingbird, the alleged Cold War-era CIA program to infiltrate American and foreign media. Not with guns or spies in trench coats, but with pens, headlines, and salaries. The agency supposedly funded journalists, planted stories, and shaped public opinion from behind the curtain. The plan was simple: control the narrative. Influence hearts and minds, not just in hostile countries, but here at home. If the CIA wanted to discredit a leader, justify a war, or bury a scandal, all it took was a byline. Dozens of prominent journalists and media outlets were reportedly connected to the operation, some wittingly, some not. The lines blurred between reporting and propaganda. The justification? National security. The enemy was communism. Truth was negotiable. And in the fog of ideological war, facts became weapons. But the cost was high. The integrity of journalism suffered. Public trust began to crack. And the seeds of modern skepticism, the ones that say, you can't believe anything you see on TV, were quietly sown by the very people claiming to protect democracy. The details remain murky. The CIA never publicly admitted to the full scope, and much of the evidence lives in redacted memos and half-buried testimonies. But even the Senate's Church Committee in the 1970s confirmed the agency's deep ties to media manipulation. The media is supposed to be the watchdog. But what happens when the watchdog takes orders from the shadows? When journalism becomes just another branch of psychological warfare. Operation Mockingbird didn't just manipulate stories, it rewrote the playbook for information warfare. And that playbook would come back in future scandals, cover-ups, and silent coups. In fact, the next chapter isn't fiction either. It's about arms deals, hostage swaps, and rebels funded by secret briefcases in violation of law. The Iran-Contra affair, 1985-1987. By the mid-1980s, the Reagan administration had a problem. Two, actually. American hostages were being held in Lebanon, and Congress had explicitly banned funding to the Contras, a brutal right-wing rebel group in Nicaragua. Most administrations would pick one crisis to solve. Reagan's team decided to break the law, twice. Enter the Iran-Contra affair, a geopolitical shell game of arms, lies, and shredded documents. Here's how it went down. The U.S. secretly sold weapons to Iran. Yes, the same Iran that was under embargo and labeled a state sponsor of terrorism, in exchange for help freeing the hostages. Then, the profits from those arms sales were funneled to the Contras in Nicaragua. The Contras were notorious for human rights abuses, but they were anti-communist, which made them friends in the White House. The scheme violated multiple U.S. laws and policies, including the Boland Amendment, which specifically forbade support for the Contras. But the architects, men like Oliver North and National Security Advisor John Poindexter, believed they were patriots, above the law, doing what Congress wouldn't. They got caught. When news of the operation leaked in 1986, the scandal exploded. Televised hearings gripped the nation. The image of North, in full-dress uniform, defending the indefensible, became iconic. Several officials were indicted. Some were convicted. Most were later pardoned by President George H.W. Bush. No one really paid the price. But the damage was done. Iran-Contra tore a hole in the illusion of government accountability. It proved the executive branch could run a shadow foreign policy, unapproved, unmonitored, and unapologetic. And when exposed, just deny, distract, and destroy the evidence. And if you thought the subversion of law was bold in foreign policy, wait until America decides that the enemy within might just be its own immigrants. The Alien and Sedition Acts, 1798. Before the ink on the Constitution had even dried, the United States government decided free speech had limits, and they were razor sharp. In 1798, under President John Adams and a Federalist-dominated Congress, the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed in a storm of political paranoia. France and Britain were at war. The U.S. was caught in the middle. And suddenly, immigrants and dissenters became the new national threat. The acts did four things. First, they made it harder for immigrants to become citizens, stretching the residency requirement from 5 to 14 years. Second and third, they allowed the president to detain or deport any non-citizen deemed dangerous. No trial, no appeal, just suspicion. And fourth, the Sedition Act. It criminalized publishing false, scandalous, and malicious statements about the government. Translation: criticize the president, go to jail. Dozens of newspaper editors were arrested. Political opponents of the Federalists, mostly Democratic Republicans, were targeted with zeal. The law was vague by design. It didn't apply to Vice President Thomas Jefferson, who opposed Adams because it only protected the president and Congress. Convenient. It was a naked power grab, cloaked in national security. Public backlash was immediate and fierce. Jeffersonians labeled it tyrannical. States like Kentucky and Virginia pushed back with resolutions hinting at the right to nullify federal laws. And when Jefferson won the presidency in 1800, the Sedition Act quietly expired, but the damage lingered. The Alien and Sedition Acts revealed just how quickly liberty could buckle under fear, and how even America's founding generation wasn't immune to silencing dissent when politically convenient. Next time you wonder how far the government might go to suppress opposition, remember, they started doing it before the 19th century even began. But suppression isn't always invisible. Sometimes the very air can turn against you. The Great Smog of Donora, 1948. Donora, Pennsylvania, a steel town on the Monongahela River. Modest, industrial, invisible to most of the country until October 1948, when the sky turned gray and the air became a weapon. It wasn't a storm. It wasn't an accident. It was the byproduct of unchecked industry, a fog of death born from steel mills and zinc plants that had long coughed poison into the atmosphere. That fall, a rare temperature inversion trapped the pollution close to the ground. The town became a gas chamber. For 5 days, residents coughed blood, staggered through the streets, and collapsed in their homes. 20 people died. Hundreds more were sickened. Birds dropped mid-flight. Pets suffocated. The smog didn't lift until Halloween, when a rainstorm finally broke the chemical seal. And here's the kicker. This wasn't the first sign. Donora's air had long been infamous. Complaints about eye irritation, breathing problems, and black residue on homes had been dismissed as the price of prosperity. The mills provided jobs. No one wanted to bite the soot-covered hand that fed them, but the 1948 disaster couldn't be ignored. It forced the nation to confront the health costs of industry. The Donora smog became a case study in environmental negligence. It pushed scientists, lawmakers, and even the public to start asking questions about air quality, corporate accountability, and the invisible price of progress. Yet justice never came. The companies denied fault. Lawsuits dragged. The dead were buried. But the truth remained suspended in the haze. This wasn't nature, it was policy. Donora's suffering was engineered by neglect and wrapped in steel profits. And as the last wisp of that deadly fog blew away, America was left with a bitter aftertaste. But sometimes the horror isn't chemical, it's ideological. The next tragedy takes us not to a factory, but a jungle. And the poison? Belief itself. The Jonestown Massacre, 1978. It started with a dream. A multiracial socialist paradise in the jungle of Guyana. A utopia free from racism, capitalism, and the sins of America. That's what Jim Jones promised when he led nearly 1,000 followers of the People's Temple out of San Francisco and into isolation. What they got was a prison made of paranoia and doctrine. Jonestown was never a sanctuary. It was a cult compound under surveillance, both internal and external. Armed guards patrolled its borders. Loudspeakers blared Jones's voice day and night. Members worked in heat and mud, malnourished, exhausted, and mentally broken. Defectors were labeled traitors. Families were divided. Escape was a fantasy. In November 1978, U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan flew to Guyana to investigate, accompanied by journalists and concerned relatives. He saw cracks immediately. Defectors approached. Tensions rose. And just as Ryan and his group prepared to leave, they were ambushed at the airstrip. Ryan, 3 journalists, and 1 defector were gunned down by Jones's loyalists. Back at the compound, Jones called for revolutionary taking their own lives. Not a metaphor, not a threat. He meant it literally. Under duress, followers lined up to drink cyanide-laced punch. Parents gave it to their children first. Babies wailed. Screams echoed. Then silence. Over 900 bodies lay sprawled across the compound, including more than 300 children. Jones shot himself last. Jonestown wasn't just a cult tragedy. It was the largest single loss of American civilian life in a deliberate act until 2001. It shattered the myth that fanaticism lived only over there. It showed that horror could bloom in peace movements, that devotion could curdle into death, and that the desire to escape America's darkness could lead people straight into the abyss. And if you think that level of abandonment was unique, wait until America turns away a ship full of refugees, fleeing death, only to be sent back toward it. The St. Louis, 1939. Now, it was supposed to be an escape, a voyage to salvation. The MS St. Louis left Hamburg in May 1939, carrying over 900 Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany. These were families, children, scholars, workers, anyone who could still get out. They had the right papers, the right fares, and the illusion that somewhere humanity still existed. Their first destination was Cuba. The Cuban government, under mounting political and anti-Semitic pressure, revoked the refugees' landing permits just days before arrival. Only a handful were allowed to disembark. The rest, hundreds of desperate men, women, and children, waited helplessly on the docked ship, staring at a shore they couldn't touch. Next came a plea to the United States. The ship hovered off the coast of Florida, so close that passengers could see the lights of Miami. They sent telegrams, begged President Roosevelt, appealed to officials. But the U.S. government held firm. Immigration quotas were full. Public opinion was cold. National security concerns and anti-Semitic attitudes did the rest. Denied entry, the St. Louis turned back to Europe. It wasn't a return to safety. Though a few countries accepted some passengers, many ended up in Belgium, the Netherlands, and France, places soon overrun by the Nazi war machine. Historians estimate that more than 250 of the ship's passengers were murdered in the Holocaust. The tragedy of the St. Louis wasn't a bureaucratic mistake. It was a moral failure wrapped in red tape. The U.S. government could have intervened. It chose not to. And in doing so, it sent a clear message to the world. Even the land of liberty had limits on its compassion. The St. Louis sailed back into obscurity, but its legacy lingers, a ghost ship haunted by the question of what could have been, had someone, anyone, opened the door. And not long after, that same government would pivot from exclusion to invasion, this time with boots on the beach and a plan that unraveled before it even hit the sand. The Bay of Pigs invasion, 1961. It was supposed to be fast, clean. A covert operation to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist regime in Cuba. The CIA-trained Cuban exiles were promised U.S. support, local uprisings, and a quick return to glory. Instead, they got bullets, betrayal, and one of the most embarrassing failures in American foreign policy history. The Bay of Pigs invasion launched on April 17, 1961. The plan was to land a force of roughly 1,400 exiles on the southern coast of Cuba, seize a beachhead, and spark a nationwide revolution. But from the start, everything unraveled. Castro's forces were prepared. The Cuban population didn't rise up, and the U.S., fearing exposure and escalation, withheld crucial air support at the last minute. Within 72 hours, the invasion collapsed. Over 100 men were killed. More than 1,000 were captured. The beaches of Cuba were littered with broken equipment and shattered dreams. The prisoners were later ransomed back to the U.S. for millions of dollars worth of food and medicine. For President John F. Kennedy, barely months into his term, it was a humiliating debut on the world stage. He took full responsibility, but the damage was done. The Bay of Pigs confirmed every communist suspicion about U.S. imperialism and set the stage for even greater tension. Most notably, the Cuban Missile Crisis the following year. The invasion was more than a military failure. It was a geopolitical boomerang. It revealed how quickly ideology could blind intelligence, how hubris could sink planning, and how the world's superpower could fumble when trying to play puppeteer. But if you thought failed invasions were bad, brace yourself. Because in Vietnam, American soldiers didn't just fight the enemy, they slaughtered a village of innocents in broad daylight. The My Lai Massacre, 1968. It was supposed to be a search and destroy mission. That's what Charlie Company of the U.S. Army was told. The village of My Lai, they were told, harbored Viet Cong insurgents. What they found instead were civilians, elders, women, children, babies. They killed them anyway. On March 16, 1968, in the Quang Ngai province of South Vietnam, American troops entered My Lai and unleashed a massacre. Villagers were rounded up, shot in ditches, mutilated, and bayoneted. Infants were thrown into the air and caught on bayonets. One soldier shot a woman praying with her child. Another opened fire into a group of huddled villagers, reloading multiple times. The killing lasted for hours. Over 500 civilians were murdered. There was no resistance, no weapons, no Viet Cong, just blood in the rice paddies. What's worse? It was covered up. The official report claimed a victory, 128 enemy combatants killed. But photos, letters, and the conscience of one helicopter pilot, Hugh Thompson, who intervened to save civilians, cracked the facade. A year later, whistleblowers forced the truth into daylight. The American public was horrified. Only one soldier, Lieutenant William Calley, was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison. He served 3 years under house arrest. My Lai didn't just stain the military. It fractured the myth of American moral superiority. It exposed the dehumanization baked into counterinsurgency. It showed how easy it was for war to turn young men into executioners, and for the system to quietly approve. The massacre radicalized anti-war sentiment. It ignited protest, and it etched one word into history books that no amount of flags or medals could erase: atrocity. And as the world tried to reckon with the truth, the question lingered. How deep did the deception go? The answer was waiting, hidden in offices just down the street from the Capitol. The Watergate scandal, 1972-1974. It began with duct tape and flashlights. In the early hours of June 17, 1972, 5 men broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. They weren't ordinary burglars. They were connected to President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign. Their mission? Plant wiretaps, photograph documents, and sabotage the opposition. They got caught. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. What followed was a tangled web of cover-ups, hush money, secret recordings, and the slow unraveling of a presidency. As reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post dug deeper, they uncovered a conspiracy that reached all the way to the Oval Office. Nixon and his top aides orchestrated efforts to obstruct the investigation. The White House directed the CIA to shut down the FBI probe. Witnesses were bribed. Perjury was encouraged. The truth was a threat, and Nixon's administration fought tooth and nail to bury it. Then came the tapes. Oval Office recordings, ordered by Nixon himself, revealed the president discussing how to derail the investigation, proving he wasn't just aware of the cover-up, he was its architect. When the Supreme Court ordered Nixon to turn over the tapes, the game was over. Facing impeachment and certain removal, Nixon resigned on August 8, 1974. It was the first time a U.S. president left office in disgrace. His successor, Gerald Ford, would later pardon him, sparking national outrage and sealing the public's deep cynicism toward government. Watergate wasn't about a break-in. It was about power, paranoia, and the slow corrosion of democratic accountability. It taught America that no office is above the law, but also that the law bends, sometimes too easily, when power leans on it. And if you thought the surveillance ended with tape recorders and wiretaps, think again. The government wasn't just spying on its enemies abroad. It had been watching its own people for years. The Church Committee, 1975. In the wake of Watergate, America started asking hard questions. What else had the government been hiding? The answer came in the form of the Church Committee, a Senate investigation led by Senator Frank Church that pulled the curtain back on decades of covert operations, surveillance, and constitutional violations by U.S. intelligence agencies. The findings were staggering. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover had spied on civil rights leaders, journalists, and political activists, including Martin Luther King Jr., who was harassed and sent blackmail threats urging him to take his own life. The CIA had conducted domestic surveillance in violation of its charter, plotted to assassinate foreign leaders, and experimented on American citizens through projects like MKUltra. The NSA had been secretly intercepting telegrams. It was the greatest hits of paranoia, power, and unchecked secrecy. These weren't rogue actions, they were systemic. Entire agencies had functioned in the shadows, accountable to no one but their own directors. The U.S. government had quietly conducted itself like a global puppet master and domestic spy ring, while publicly preaching democracy and civil liberties. The Church Committee didn't just expose these abuses, it forced reforms. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, was born. Intelligence agencies were put under greater congressional oversight, but the stain remained. Americans learned that their trust had been misplaced, not in a few bad apples, but in entire orchards. The Church Committee confirmed what conspiracy theorists had long whispered. The government really had been watching, manipulating, silencing, and for decades no one stopped them. But surveillance was just one part of the arsenal. Next up, the FBI's underground war on activists, radicals, and civil rights icons. The COINTELPRO program, where disruption became doctrine. The COINTELPRO program, 1956-1971. COINTELPRO was the FBI's covert campaign of domestic sabotage, born out of fear and fed by prejudice. It stands for Counterintelligence Program, a bland name for something far more sinister. Its mission? Not to solve crimes, but to infiltrate, surveil, discredit, and destroy political organizations deemed subversive. The targets were wide-ranging: civil rights groups, black liberation movements, anti-war protesters, feminists, Native American activists, socialists, and more. If you had a megaphone and an unpopular opinion, the FBI had a file on you. The methods were dirty. Infiltration by informants, anonymous letters to stir paranoia, fake documents, blackmail, smear campaigns, sabotaging marriages, forcing internal splits. One memo stated the goal was to prevent the rise of a Messiah who could unify and electrify the militant black nationalist movement. Martin Luther King Jr. was a primary target. The FBI wiretapped his phones, bugged his hotel rooms, and mailed him an anonymous letter urging him to kill himself. They feared his charisma more than his politics. Other targets included the Black Panther Party, which was painted as a terrorist threat. Chapters were raided. Leaders were arrested or killed, like Fred Hampton, shot in his bed during a pre-dawn raid coordinated with local police. COINTELPRO operated for 15 years, entirely in the dark. Its existence only came to light when activists broke into an FBI office and stole classified documents. The scandal exploded. Public hearings followed. The program was officially disbanded, but its tactics never fully disappeared. What COINTELPRO revealed was chilling. The U.S. government saw dissent as danger, and it was willing to crush it, not with debate, but with deception. Civil liberties were optional. Truth was malleable. Justice had conditions. And that paranoia didn't die with the 70s. It simply changed outfits. Because the next era would turn one man's witch hunt into a national spectacle, complete with blacklists, ruined lives, and a senator drunk on fear. The McCarthy era, 1950-1954. There wasn't a war. There weren't bullets. But there were victims, thousands of them. Careers shattered, reputations ruined, families torn apart, all because one man stood in front of a microphone and declared, "I have here in my hand a list." That man was Senator Joseph McCarthy, and the era that bore his name became one of the most infamous witch hunts in American history. The enemy was communism. But McCarthy didn't target spies or saboteurs. He targeted whispers, accusations, associations, the vague stench of un-American activity. With little more than rumor and innuendo, McCarthy accused hundreds of being communists or communist sympathizers. The accused included government employees, Hollywood screenwriters, university professors, and even decorated war heroes. The Senate became a stage. McCarthy was its lead actor, playing to the cameras, wielding fear like a club. He chaired hearings. He grilled witnesses. He turned guilt into a spectacle. And those who refused to name names, blacklisted, imprisoned, silenced. It wasn't just McCarthy. The House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, fanned the flames. The FBI under Hoover kept files on suspected subversives. The entertainment industry caved. Friends betrayed friends. Careers in journalism, art, education, all erased with a whisper. But the show couldn't last forever. In 1954, McCarthy went too far. He targeted the U.S. Army. The televised Army McCarthy hearings exposed his cruelty, his bluster, his recklessness. And when Joseph Welch, a lawyer for the Army, looked at McCarthy and asked, "Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?" The spell broke. McCarthy was censured by the Senate. He died a few years later, disgraced. But the damage was done. The scars remained. And the fear he cultivated, that never really left. Because fear is contagious. And the next tragedy was born not from political paranoia, but from a fire escape locked tight. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, 1911. It was supposed to be just another workday. March 25th, 1911. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory occupied the top 3 floors of the Ash Building in New York City. Hundreds of workers, mostly young immigrant women, many teenagers, sat shoulder to shoulder, sewing garments in stifling conditions. The hours were long. The pay was meager. The rules were strict. Then came the smoke. A fire started on the 8th floor. In minutes, it spread through the building, feeding on fabric scraps and paper patterns. Panic erupted. But when workers tried to flee, they found the exit doors locked. Management had sealed them, supposedly to prevent theft and unauthorized breaks. With no way out, women began jumping from windows. Bodies hit the pavement. Flames licked the air, and the building became a beacon of horror. The fire department arrived, but their ladders didn't reach past the 6th floor. Their nets tore under the weight of falling bodies. In less than 20 minutes, 146 people were dead. The aftermath was furious. Public outrage surged. The owners, Isaac Harris and Max Blank, were put on trial. But they were acquitted. Their defense? There wasn't enough proof. They knew the doors were locked. They paid small settlements to the victims' families, about $75 per life. But the fire ignited more than just cloth and flesh. It lit a movement. Labor activists rallied. The tragedy became a catalyst for workplace reforms. Fire safety codes, building inspections, better conditions, and the rise of unions. Frances Perkins, who witnessed the fire and later became Secretary of Labor, called it the day the New Deal began. The Triangle Fire didn't just expose the cruelty of industrial capitalism. It exposed its indifference. It showed what happens when profit trumps humanity, when lives become line items, and when warnings go unheeded until it's too late. But even in death, the workers left something behind, a rallying cry. And that cry would echo in the tunnels beneath the Midwest, where another fire would trap men in darkness and bureaucracy. The Centralia mine disaster, 1947. Coal built America. It fueled its factories, powered its trains, and lit its homes. But deep beneath the surface, the men who dug it out worked in graves in waiting. On March 25, 1947, exactly 36 years after the Triangle Fire, those graves filled in Centralia, Illinois. The Centralia No. 5 coal mine was a ticking bomb. The signs had been there for months: dangerous gas levels, poor ventilation, coal dust piling up like dry tinder. Miners filed complaints. Safety inspectors took notes. Warnings were sent all the way to Washington. But nothing changed. Production stayed king. That morning, 142 miners descended into the shaft. Hours later, an explosion ripped through the tunnels. Flames and toxic gases swallowed men whole. The air turned to poison. Only 31 miners made it out alive. The rest suffocated, burned, or were crushed by debris. Rescue efforts dragged on for days. Families waited at the mouth of the mine, praying for names that would never be called. Inside, bodies were recovered in pieces, blackened and broken. The stench of coal and charred flesh hung in the air. The cause? Negligence. A federal report later confirmed that safety protocols had been ignored. Officials knew the mine was dangerous. The miners knew. Everyone knew. But closing it down would have cost money. So the risk was managed. The tragedy ignited public fury. President Truman ordered a national investigation. Laws were proposed. But accountability? That remained buried with the dead. No executives went to jail. The mine reopened. And America moved on. Centralia was more than a disaster. It was a lesson unlearned. A reminder that industrial death isn't always sudden. It's often slow, bureaucratic, and entirely preventable. And as the smoke cleared from the mine, another darker cloud began to rise, not from the earth, but from the laws that divided it. The Jim Crow laws, late 19th century, mid-20th century. After the Civil War, Black Americans were promised freedom. They were told that they were now citizens, that justice and equality would follow emancipation. But instead, they got a new kind of bondage, one dressed in legislation, upheld by courts, and enforced with lynch ropes. Jim Crow wasn't a person. It was a system. A legalized apartheid that stretched across the southern United States and seeped into the north. It mandated segregation in every aspect of life: schools, transportation, restrooms, water fountains, hospitals, cemeteries. Separate but equal, they said. But it was never equal, just separate and degrading. Black people were denied the right to vote through poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. Those who dared challenge the system faced economic retribution, social exile, or violence. Often, all three. White mobs operated with impunity. Courts turned a blind eye. Police were enforcers, not protectors. And the culture? It reinforced the laws. Blackface minstrel shows mocked black humanity. Textbooks rewrote slavery as a civilizing mission. The myth of racial inferiority was not just tolerated. It was institutionalized. Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 codified this nightmare. The Supreme Court ruled that segregation was constitutional, legitimizing Jim Crow for decades. It would take until Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 to begin dismantling the legal foundation, and even longer to chip away at the social rot it left behind. Jim Crow didn't just divide a nation, it deformed it. It trained generations to see hierarchy as natural, to believe that race could dictate where you sit, live, learn, eat, and die. And while the South codified exclusion, the West went even further by keeping some people out altogether. The next chapter in America's racialized legal history came stamped with xenophobia and a federal seal, the Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882. In the mid-1800s, Chinese immigrants were drawn to the U.S. by the promise of gold and opportunity. They built railroads, mined mountains, and worked jobs white laborers refused to touch. But prosperity doesn't protect you when resentment festers. As the American economy faltered and anti-immigrant sentiment surged, Chinese workers became scapegoats. Newspapers called them a yellow peril. Politicians blamed them for unemployment and cultural decline. Violence followed. Lynchings, riots, expulsions. Entire Chinatowns were torched. Then came the legislation. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first major federal law to explicitly ban immigration based on race or nationality. It halted the immigration of Chinese laborers for 10 years and declared Chinese immigrants ineligible for citizenship. It was supposed to be temporary. It lasted over 60 years. The act legitimized racism at the federal level. It told the nation and the world that some groups were too foreign, too threatening, too unassimilable to belong. Families were separated. Men lived in bachelor societies, unable to bring wives or children. Those already in the U.S. were forced to carry identification papers at all times or risk deportation. Chinese Americans were not just unwelcome, they were hunted. Raids, inspections, detentions. Even citizens were harassed, their status constantly questioned. The exclusion became embedded in the American bureaucracy, shaping immigration policy for decades. It wasn't until 1943, during World War II, when China became a U.S. ally, that the act was finally repealed. But the damage had been done. A generation had lived and died in the shadow of exclusion. The Chinese Exclusion Act didn't just bar immigrants, it established a precedent that citizenship, rights, and dignity could be rationed by race, that American could be defined by whiteness. And as the Pacific War raged, America would double down on exclusion, not through denial of entry, but through mass incarceration. This time, the victims were citizens. The Japanese-American internment, 1942-1945. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. went to war, not just against Japan, but against its own people. With Executive Order 9066, over 120,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of them U.S. citizens, were forcibly removed from their homes and incarcerated in remote camps. They weren't charged with crimes. There were no trials, no due process. Their only offense was ancestry. Entire families were given days, sometimes hours, to pack what they could carry. Businesses were shuttered. Homes were abandoned or sold for pennies. Farmers left crops to rot. Neighborhoods emptied overnight. They were sent to barbed wire camps in deserts and swamps, under armed guard, in stifling heat and freezing cold. The government called it relocation. But this wasn't about safety. It was about fear, about racism. Military officials and politicians framed Japanese Americans as potential saboteurs. The press fanned the flames. Public opinion demanded action. And the Constitution? It was suspended. Inside the camps, life was bleak. Families crammed into one-room barracks, communal latrines, military rations, surveillance. Despite everything, many internees tried to build normalcy, creating schools, sports leagues, newspapers. Some even volunteered for military service to prove their loyalty to the country that had imprisoned them. The Supreme Court upheld the internment in Korematsu versus United States, a ruling that wouldn't be formally discredited until decades later. The camps began to close in 1945, but the damage was permanent. Lives were shattered, livelihoods lost, trust in the American promise broken. In 1988, the U.S. government formally apologized and paid reparations to survivors. But no apology can unwrite history. Japanese-American internment was a constitutional betrayal, a wartime hysteria that targeted the innocent. And it proved, yet again, how easily liberty bends when fear and racism hold the pen. And while the war provided one excuse to silence dissent, peace brought its own version. one where speaking out against war itself could put you behind bars. The Espionage Act of 1917 and Sedition Act of 1918. War makes governments paranoid. And when the U.S. entered World War I in 1917, the paranoia was written into law. The Espionage Act of 1917 criminalized interference with military operations, support of U.S. enemies during wartime, and, crucially, any attempt to obstruct the draft. It was followed in 1918 by the Sedition Act, which broadened the scope. Speaking out against the government, the military, the Constitution, or even the American flag could land you in prison. Criticism became treason. Dissent was equated with disloyalty. These weren't hypothetical scenarios. Over 2,000 Americans were prosecuted under these laws. Socialist leader Eugene V. Debs was sentenced to 10 years in prison simply for giving a speech opposing the draft. Newspapers were shut down. Activists were arrested. Immigrants were deported. And in the process, the First Amendment, the cornerstone of American liberty, was effectively suspended. The language of the laws was deliberately vague, allowing authorities to stretch definitions and weaponize patriotism. If you questioned the war, you were accused of aiding the enemy. If you distributed anti-war leaflets, you were labeled a spy. The Supreme Court upheld the laws in a series of decisions, including the infamous Schenck versus United States, which introduced the clear and present danger test. The logic was simple. Rights end where the war effort begins. These acts weren't repealed after the war. In fact, the Espionage Act is still on the books today and has been used in modern whistleblower cases. The Sedition Act was eventually repealed, but its legacy lingers, a chilling reminder of how quickly free speech can become a casualty of fear. And speaking of casualties, the next scandal wasn't about speech. It was about oil. And it proved that even natural resources could be sold off in smoky back rooms. The Teapot Dome Scandal, 1921-1922. Oil, land, power. The trifecta of early 20th century corruption. The Teapot Dome Scandal wasn't just the biggest political scandal of its time. It was the first real test of whether the executive branch could be bought and sold. At the heart of the scandal was Albert B. Fall, Secretary of the Interior under President Warren G. Harding. Fall secretly leased federal oil reserves at Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and 2 other locations to private companies without competitive bidding. These weren't small operations. These were government-held strategic reserves intended for use by the Navy. In return, Fall received bribes. Lots of them. Over $400,000 in loans, bonds, and cash, equivalent to several $1 million today. It was a slick, under-the-table arrangement dressed up as business as usual. But it didn't stay quiet for long. Reporters smelled something rotten. The Senate launched an investigation. Testimony revealed the full extent of the corruption. Kickbacks, shady deals, falsified paperwork. The fallout rocked the Harding administration, which was already reeling from other scandals. Albert Fall became the first former cabinet member in U.S. history to go to prison for crimes committed while in office. He served time for accepting bribes, though the oilmen who gave him the money escaped conviction. Justice was partial. Accountability was selective. But the scandal stuck. Teapot Dome became shorthand for governmental corruption, a symbol of what happens when public resources are sold off like poker chips. It highlighted the fragility of institutional trust and the ease with which wealth can seep into policy. Harding, already in declining health, died before the full story unraveled. His presidency remains one of the most scandal-ridden in history. And while Teapot Dome drained the nation's trust, the next disaster would drown it, literally. A flood was coming, and it wouldn't just submerge homes. It would expose racial injustice written into the levees. The Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. It began with rain. Months of it. By the spring of 1927, the Mississippi River was swollen and angry, overflowing its banks and swallowing the South. The flood covered over 27,000 square miles across 10 states. But the true disaster wasn't just the water. It was how the government chose who would survive and who would suffer. Hundreds of thousands were displaced. Homes, crops, and entire towns were washed away. The death toll remains uncertain, but estimates range into the thousands. Relief efforts were chaotic and uneven, but here's where the horror sharpens. African American sharecroppers, the backbone of Southern labor, were deliberately left behind or forcibly kept on levees to prevent breaches. In some cases, black men were rounded up at gunpoint, forced to pile sandbags for days with no pay or shelter. When the waters rose, they were abandoned. White plantation owners ensured their own land was protected first. Meanwhile, aid for black communities was delayed or denied outright. The Red Cross set up segregated camps. Conditions for black refugees were often squalid, with inadequate food, overcrowding, and constant surveillance. Some were kept in de facto concentration camps, forbidden to leave, and subjected to beatings or worse. And when the floodwaters finally receded, the government promised compensation. But most black families never saw a dime. Instead, they faced eviction, job loss, and renewed violence. The flood reinforced the racial caste system of the Jim Crow South, turning a natural disaster into a political weapon. The Great Mississippi Flood wasn't just about weather, it was about power. It demonstrated how disaster response could be shaped by race, how recovery could be allocated based on skin color, and how catastrophe magnified injustice. And as the levees broke in Mississippi, something else was breaking in the North, a fragile peace on campus, soon to be shattered by gunfire. The Kent State and Jackson State shootings, 1970. 1970 was the year the American campus became a battlefield. The country was neck-deep in Vietnam, and when President Nixon announced the expansion of the war into Cambodia, the outrage exploded like dry kindling. Protests erupted across universities. But in two places, Kent State in Ohio and Jackson State in Mississippi, the government answered that outrage with bullets. On May 4th at Kent State, National Guard troops confronted student protesters. The students were unarmed. Some were protesting. Others were simply walking to class. The guardsmen opened fire. 13 seconds. 67 shots. 4 students were killed. 9 wounded. One of the dead was an ROTC cadet. Another was a 14-year-old girl visiting the campus. The shock was immediate and nationwide. Kent State was a political earthquake. But the aftershock was quieter and deadlier. Just 10 days later, on May 15th, students at Jackson State College, a historically black institution, protested police presence on campus and broader racial injustice. Police opened fire on a women's dormitory. The gunfire lasted 30 seconds. 2 students were killed. A dozen more were wounded. Unlike Kent State, the Jackson State tragedy barely made national headlines. Why? Because the victims were black. Because Jackson State didn't have photojournalists on every corner. Because America's outrage had racial limits. The government never truly apologized. Few were held accountable. The message was clear. Protest is dangerous, especially if you're young, radical, and inconvenient. Whether it's white students in Ohio or black students in Mississippi, dissent was treated as provocation. The Kent and Jackson State shootings weren't isolated. They were part of a broader pattern of institutions cracking down on those who questioned war, racism, or authority. The campus wasn't safe. The classroom wasn't sacred. And America had decided that law and order came with a body count. But if those students thought they were safe because they had books instead of weapons, the next generation would learn a darker lesson. Some people weren't even safe in their own homes, under the protection of law. The Reign of Terror in Reconstruction, 1865, 1877. The Civil War may have ended in 1865, but the South had no intention of surrendering its racial order. The period of Reconstruction, intended to rebuild the nation and grant rights to freed slaves, was met with a furious and coordinated campaign of terror. And the architects of that terror wore hoods, held torches, and wrapped their violence in the American flag. The Ku Klux Klan emerged from the ashes of defeat. What began as a social club of former Confederate officers quickly metastasized into a paramilitary death cult. Their mission was simple: destroy black political power before it could take root. And they did it with lynchings, whippings, arson, and assassinations. Black men who dared vote were dragged from polling places and beaten. Elected black officials were murdered in their homes. Entire black communities were burned to the ground. White supremacist militias, often operating with the quiet approval of local authorities, unleashed wave after wave of violence. It wasn't just the Klan. Groups like the White League and the Red Shirts sprang up, terrorizing black citizens and white allies alike. They aimed to redeem the South, which really meant restoring white democratic control through intimidation and murder. The federal government tried to intervene. The enforcement acts were passed. Federal troops were deployed. There were brief victories, convictions, disbanded cells, ballots cast under protection. But the willpower to maintain that protection faded. Northern fatigue set in. Political compromises were made, and when federal troops were withdrawn in 1877, the South sealed the deal. What followed was the institutionalization of segregation and disenfranchisement through Jim Crow laws. Reconstruction's brief promise was smothered under a pillow of white violence and Northern apathy. The Reign of Terror wasn't just about brutality. It was about power. And it worked. For nearly a century, the South remained politically and racially locked in place. Terror had done what bullets and ballots could not. And in the industrial North, a new kind of battle was brewing. One not over race, but labor. And the price of striking for your rights? Blood in the river. The Homestead Strike, 1892. Andrew Carnegie was the face of American industry. Rags to riches, the steel titan of Pittsburgh. But behind the philanthropy and gospel of wealth was a ruthless corporate machine. And in 1892, it met its reckoning at the Homestead Steel Works. Workers there, part of the powerful Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, had been pushing back against wage cuts and dangerous conditions. They were skilled, organized, determined. Carnegie, conveniently overseas, left his anti-union lieutenant Henry Clay Frick in charge. Frick decided it was time to crush the union. When contract negotiations broke down, Frick locked out the workers and fortified the plant like a fortress. He built a literal wall, hired 300 private security guards from the notorious Pinkerton Detective Agency, and prepared for war. On July 6th, the Pinkertons attempted to land by river under cover of night. The workers were waiting. A full-scale battle erupted. Guns, clubs, bricks, and fire. The river ran red. After a 12-hour siege, the Pinkertons surrendered, humiliated and bleeding. But the victory was short-lived. The governor of Pennsylvania sent in 8,000 state militia to take back the plant and break the strike. Public opinion, initially sympathetic to the workers, shifted after an anarchist unrelated to the union attempted to assassinate Frick. The media painted the strikers as radicals. The union collapsed. Blacklisted workers never returned. Homestead remained non-union for decades. The strike marked a turning point in U.S. labor history. It showed that corporate power, backed by private armies and state troops, would stop at nothing to break organized labor. And it signaled to every worker in America, know your place, or the Pinkertons will teach it to you. And just 2 years later, another labor revolt would explode, this time on a national scale, with the federal government rolling in on iron wheels to crush it. The Pullman Strike, 1894. It started with a town that was supposed to be a utopia. The Pullman Company, famous for its luxury railroad sleeping cars, had built a model town for its workers just outside Chicago. Neat houses, clean streets, and a carefully controlled environment. But it wasn't paradise. It was a gilded cage. Workers paid rent to the company, bought groceries from the company store, lived in company-owned homes where alcohol was banned and behavior was monitored. Then, in 1893, the economy tanked. Pullman slashed wages but didn't lower rents. Families starved while executives thrived. In May 1894, workers walked off the job. Their demand was simple: fair wages. The American Railway Union, led by Eugene V. Debs, backed them. Soon, the strike ballooned into a nationwide boycott of trains carrying Pullman cars. Rail traffic ground to a halt. Mail deliveries were disrupted. The country's arteries clogged with stalled steel. President Grover Cleveland declared the strike a federal emergency. He sent in 12,000 troops, not to protect workers, but to break the strike. Violence followed. Riots erupted. Trains were set ablaze. Soldiers fired into crowds. At least 30 workers were killed. Debs was arrested. The strike collapsed, and the message was clear: when labor stands up, the state stands on its neck. The Pullman strike wasn't just a battle over wages. It was a turning point in American labor history. It showed how quickly industrial conflict could become national crisis, how the law could be twisted to favor capital, and how deep the federal government would dig its boots into the backs of working people. But Pullman's utopia was just one of many illusions. The next scandal would reveal an entire web of corruption, one soaked in whiskey and patronage. The whiskey ring, 1875. It was supposed to be just another tax. Whiskey distillers owed a federal excise, and in the Reconstruction-era U.S., every cent mattered. But instead of collecting, a secret network of politicians, government agents, and industry insiders decided to skim. The whiskey ring was a complex bribery scheme where distillers paid off tax collectors to underreport production, keeping millions in tax revenue for themselves. At its height, the ring stretched from St. Louis to Washington, D.C., with tentacles inside the Treasury Department itself. The scandal exploded in 1875 under President Ulysses S. Grant. His administration, already tainted by other scandals, took a massive hit when it was revealed that his own personal secretary, Orville E. Babcock, was involved. Grant stood by Babcock, even testifying on his behalf, a rare and controversial move by a sitting president. Despite dozens of convictions, many of the key figures walked free. Political pressure, legal maneuvering, familiar themes. The whiskey ring revealed how Reconstruction-era corruption wasn't just Southern, it was systemic. It lived in federal offices and behind marble walls. The real cost wasn't just financial, it was trust. Americans saw the federal government not as a moral force, but as a marketplace for influence. The notion of a government for the people looked more like a racket. And while the elites were pocketing bribes, far from Washington, in the swamps of the South, a different kind of rebellion was brewing. One born not of corruption, but of desperation and chains. The Stono Rebellion, 1739. Before America was even a country, it was already soaked in resistance. The Stono Rebellion, one of the largest slave uprisings in colonial history, took place in South Carolina in 1739. It was brief, bloody, and brutally suppressed, but its echoes would last for centuries. It began with a drumbeat, literally. On a Sunday morning, a group of enslaved Africans, many from Angola, gathered near the Stono River. They broke into a store, armed themselves with guns and ammunition, and began marching south toward Spanish Florida, where freedom had been promised to any enslaved person who escaped British rule. They chanted liberty as they went, burning plantations and killing slaveholders. Their numbers grew as they marched, eventually swelling to about 80. It was a declaration of war, a cry for liberation in a land that denied their humanity. The colonial militia responded swiftly and mercilessly. The rebels were overtaken, many killed in battle. Others were captured, tortured, and publicly executed. Their heads were placed on pikes as a warning to others. In response, the colony passed even harsher slave codes. The Negro Act of 1740 forbade enslaved people from growing their own food, assembling in groups, learning to read, or earning money. The goal was simple: make rebellion impossible. But Stono couldn't be erased. It proved that resistance was inevitable, that even under unimaginable oppression, The desire for freedom burned hotter than the threat of death, and while the South wrote harsher laws, the North would soon erupt in its own violent protest. Not for liberty, but for fear of losing what little power the working class thought they had. The New York City draft riots, 1863. In the middle of the Civil War, while Union soldiers bled on Southern soil, New York City exploded. It wasn't a Confederate invasion. It was a riot, a violent, chaotic, race-fueled revolt triggered by class resentment and the brutal inequities of war. In July 1863, the federal government instituted a draft for the first time in U.S. history. But there was a catch. If you had $300, you could pay for a substitute to take your place. For New York's wealthy elite, war was optional. For the working-class poor, mostly Irish immigrants, it was mandatory. Resentment boiled over. What began as a protest against the draft quickly morphed into something uglier. On July 13th, mobs flooded the streets. Government buildings were attacked. The draft office was burned to the ground. Police were overwhelmed. But the rage didn't stop at the government. It turned toward black residents. The rioters blamed black Americans for the war. They feared free black labor would compete for scarce jobs. So they lynched, beat, and mutilated any black person they found. The colored orphan asylum was torched, while children fled in terror. Homes and businesses of black families were looted and destroyed. The violence was unrelenting. Over 5 days, the city descended into anarchy. Federal troops were pulled from Gettysburg to restore order. By the time the smoke cleared, at least 120 people were dead. The actual number may have been higher. The New York City draft riots remain one of the bloodiest civil disturbances in American history. They expose the fragile alliance between race and class, the volatility of manufactured hatred, and the hypocrisy of a war fought for freedom, while one half of the nation still burned with white supremacy. And just a few decades later, the government would again turn its guns on indigenous people, not in battle, but in slaughter under the snow. The Wounded Knee Massacre, 1890. The snow fell silently on the plains of South Dakota, but what happened at Wounded Knee was anything but quiet. On December 29, 1890, the U.S. 7th Cavalry surrounded a camp of Lakota Sioux near Wounded Knee Creek. The tension was electric. The Lakota had already surrendered. They were disarmed, or so the soldiers thought. The real threat, as seen by the government, wasn't violence. It was the ghost dance, a spiritual revival among native tribes that preached hope, resistance, and the return of their ancestral world. To white officials, it looked like an uprising, so they sent troops. As the soldiers tried to confiscate weapons, a scuffle broke out. A single shot rang out, and then the slaughter began. Cannons were fired at point-blank range. Bullets ripped through tents. Women and children were gunned down as they fled. Many were hunted into the snow and executed. Survivors spoke of bodies frozen in grotesque poses, scattered across the white earth like broken dolls. By the end, around 300 Lakota lay dead, most of them unarmed. It wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. And yet 20 soldiers received the Medal of Honor for their role in the carnage. Wounded Knee marked the end of the so-called Indian Wars. It wasn't a victory. It was a coda to decades of genocide, removal, and betrayal. The U.S. government buried its guilt under patriotic rhetoric. The Lakota buried their dead in mass graves. For indigenous people, Wounded Knee wasn't history. It was trauma, handed down through generations. A symbol of a government that broke every promise and met every prayer with powder and lead. But the U.S. wasn't done playing kingmaker abroad either. In the next chapter, the CIA would take its playbook to the deserts of Iran, where democracy was overthrown not by guns, but by a coup in a pinstripe suit. The Central Intelligence Agency's role in the 1953 Iranian coup d'etat, Iran, 1953. A nation on the edge of modernity, led by Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, a secular democratic reformer. He had nationalized the Iranian oil industry, kicking out British corporations and standing up to imperial interests. The people loved him. The West did not. The British, furious over the loss of their oil profits, sought help from an ally, the United States. The newly minted CIA, eager to prove its Cold War credentials, agreed to intervene. Operation Ajax was born, a covert plan to overthrow Mossadegh and reinstall the Shah, a Western-friendly monarch. It was espionage in broad daylight. The CIA bribed Iranian officials, paid mobs to riot, and planted propaganda in newspapers. They manipulated public perception, staged protests, and created the illusion of chaos. On August the 19th, the coup succeeded. Mossadegh was arrested. The Shah returned to power, and Iran's brief democratic experiment was over. The fallout was enormous. The Shah ruled with an iron fist for decades, supported by U.S. weapons and training. His regime was brutal, repressive, and deeply unpopular. The resentment festered. By 1979, it exploded into the Islamic Revolution, ushering in a theocratic regime and 4 decades of hostility between Iran and the United States. The CIA's involvement in the 1953 coup wasn't just a footnote. It was a turning point. It revealed that American foreign policy could be dictated not by principles, but by oil contracts and geopolitical chess. Democracy could be discarded if it didn't align with corporate interests. And while Tehran burned with betrayal, the CIA turned its gaze to another small republic, not in the Middle East, but in Central America, where another democratically elected leader was about to be erased. The Central Intelligence Agency's role in the 1954 Guatemalan coup d'etat. Guatemala in the early 1950s was not a land of chaos. It was a fragile democracy trying to build itself up from centuries of colonial and elite dominance. Its president, Jacobo Arbenz, was no revolutionary firebrand. He was a modest reformer, a military officer turned statesman who believed land should belong to those who worked it. His fatal mistake? Challenging the United Fruit Company. The U.S.-based agribusiness behemoth owned vast swaths of Guatemalan land, most of it unused, but kept fallow for tax purposes. Arbenz passed land reform laws, expropriating idle lands to redistribute to the peasantry. He even offered compensation. But United Fruit didn't want payment. They wanted power. So they called in their connections, deep ties in the U.S. State Department and the CIA, many of whom were former lawyers or board members for the company. The threat of communism was invoked, and the Eisenhower administration took the bait, or pretended to. In 1954, Operation PB Success was launched. The CIA orchestrated a psychological warfare campaign, broadcasting fake radio reports, distributing propaganda, and funding a small mercenary army led by Carlos Castillo Armas. Though militarily weak, the operation succeeded in breaking Arbenz's resolve. Facing internal dissent, foreign pressure, and a collapsing army, he resigned and fled the country. Castillo Armas took power and immediately rolled back reforms. The land went back to the elite. The repression began. What followed was decades of military dictatorship, civil war, and genocide, culminating in the deaths of over 200,000 people, many of them indigenous. The Guatemalan coup was more than a Cold War operation. It was a warning. Democracy would be tolerated only when it served foreign capital. National sovereignty was expendable. Reform could be labeled communist and snuffed out before it spread. And as the CIA moved its chess pieces in Guatemala, a darker collaboration was forming further south, one that wouldn't just topple leaders, but disappear them entirely. Operation Condor, 1970s, 1980s. In the back rooms of South American military regimes, a secret war was being waged. Not on communists with guns, but on students, journalists, dissidents, and anyone who dared to dream differently. Operation Condor was the code name for a coordinated campaign of state-sponsored terror across the Southern Cone. And the United States didn't just know about it, It helped design the board. Launched in the 1970s, Operation Condor united the intelligence agencies of right-wing dictatorships in Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Brazil. Its purpose was brutal: track, kidnap, torture, and kill leftist opponents across borders without due process. Victims were often disappeared. They were abducted, interrogated, and executed. Their bodies dumped in rivers, unmarked graves, or never found at all. The CIA and U.S. military advisors provided training, intelligence, and surveillance tools. American satellites watched. Files were shared. Silence was bought. The rationale? Containment of communism. The reality? A campaign of mass murder with bureaucratic precision. Tens of thousands were killed or vanished. Families waited decades for answers that never came. Children were stolen from political prisoners and raised by their captors. Universities became death traps. Newsrooms emptied. Fear colonized every aspect of life. While Washington officially condemned human rights abuses, documents declassified years later revealed a stark contradiction. U.S. officials knew the scope of the atrocities, and they kept the support flowing. Operation Condor wasn't just a South American tragedy. It was a U.S.-enabled horror, a demonstration of how Cold War ideology turned the hemisphere into a hunting ground for authoritarian violence, with American fingerprints on every map. And in Vietnam, that same blueprint would evolve into something even more intimate, targeting not just insurgents, but entire networks of civilians, using lists, torture, and bullets in the dark. The Phoenix Program, Vietnam War. The Vietnam War wasn't just fought in the jungle. It was waged in whispers, dossiers, and midnight raids. The Phoenix Program, created by the CIA and South Vietnamese allies, was a counterinsurgency operation designed to neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure, meaning anyone thought to support the communist cause. From 1967 to 1972, Phoenix functioned as a shadow war. The targets were political operatives, informants, and low-level cadres. But the methods? Pure terror. Suspects were kidnapped, tortured, and often killed, without trial, without appeal, without certainty. Intelligence was spotty. Lists were compiled by rivals. People were disappeared based on rumor, vendetta, or guesswork. Interrogation centers were established across South Vietnam. Torture was routine. Electrocution, waterboarding, beatings, humiliation. Bodies turned up in rivers, shallow graves, or not at all. American operatives trained and sometimes directly participated in these operations, creating an infrastructure of repression that rivaled anything seen in Latin America. The numbers are staggering. Estimates suggest that over 20,000 people were killed through Phoenix. Some were undoubtedly Viet Cong. Many were not. The collateral damage became the point. Terrorize the population. Break the morale. Silence the underground. Officially, the program was justified as a necessary evil, an intelligence operation against an embedded insurgency. But whistleblowers and journalists painted a different picture of systemic abuse, corruption, and a moral abyss. The Phoenix Program didn't end the war. It didn't break the enemy. But it left behind a legacy of war crimes and trauma. It showed how far a superpower would go when ideology triumphed over humanity. And just when Vietnam couldn't get darker, the next weapon would change everything. Sprayed from the sky, invisible at first, until the sickness took root in generations. The use of Agent Orange in Vietnam, 1961-1971. War has always poisoned the land. But in Vietnam, the U.S. didn't just scar the earth, it saturated it with death. Between 1961 and 1971, as part of Operation Ranch Hand, American forces sprayed over 20 million gallons of herbicides across South Vietnam. Chief among them was Agent Orange, a chemical cocktail designed to strip the jungle bare, rob the Viet Cong of cover, and flush out an enemy hidden in the foliage. It worked, but the consequences were catastrophic. Agent Orange contained dioxin, one of the most toxic substances known to science. It wasn't just trees that died. The poison seeped into rivers, soil, and the DNA of everyone it touched. Vietnamese villages were drenched in it. Farmers returned to find their crops dead and their livestock dying. Children were born with grotesque deformities, missing limbs, twisted spines, organs outside their bodies. American soldiers weren't spared either. Those who handled the chemical or moved through contaminated zones developed cancers, skin disorders, and neurological diseases. Their children, too, were born with defects. The war passed down through chromosomes like a family curse. The U.S. government denied the connection for years. Veterans were dismissed. Vietnamese victims ignored. It wasn't until decades later that the full scope of the damage was acknowledged. And even then, compensation was slow and incomplete. Agent Orange didn't just defoliate trees, it defoliated trust. It became a symbol of modern warfare's inhumanity, of scientific advancement turned against life itself. And the victims, millions of them, still suffer in silence, their pain inherited and invisible. As the jungle rotted under the orange rain, America's moral high ground evaporated. And in the decades that followed, that rot would find a new home, not in the battlefield, but inside prison walls in the heart of Iraq. The Abu Ghraib torture and prisoner abuse scandal, 2004, Iraq. 2004, the U.S. had toppled Saddam Hussein and promised liberation. But inside the walls of Abu Ghraib prison, liberation looked like hooded figures, dog leashes, and piles of naked men. Photographs leaked, and the world recoiled. American soldiers posing with detainees like hunting trophies, grinning next to stacks of naked prisoners, holding thumbs up beside men forced into sexual positions, beaten, bloodied, and broken. One image showed a man hooded, standing on a box with wires attached to his fingers, told he would be electrocuted if he moved. These weren't rogue actors. The abuse was systemic. The CIA and military intelligence officers oversaw interrogations. Enhanced techniques blurred into torture, waterboarding, sleep deprivation, mock executions, psychological torment. Most of the prisoners hadn't even been charged. Many were innocent. The justification? Intelligence gathering. The reality? Dehumanization made routine. War made theater. Morality made malleable. The fallout was global. The images became propaganda for insurgents. The U.S. lost credibility in its supposed war for democracy. Investigations followed, but justice was sparse. A handful of low-ranking soldiers were punished. Higher-ups skated by with apologies and promotions. Abu Ghraib wasn't just a scandal. It was a rupture. It proved that even with the world watching, the machinery of war would chew through ethics without flinching. It showed how fast the line between security and sadism could vanish. And while these bodies were tortured in secret, others, much smaller, had been buried in secret for generations, forgotten by history, until their graves began to whisper. The discovery of mass graves at former Native American boarding schools. For over a century, Native American children were stolen from their families under the guise of education. They were sent to boarding schools, often far from home, run by the government or religious institutions. Their hair was cut, their languages banned, their identities erased. "Kill the Indian, save the man," was the slogan. What wasn't said out loud, but always known, was that many never came home. In recent years, ground-penetrating radar and survivor testimony have uncovered mass graves at the sites of former boarding schools across North America. Rows of unmarked, undocumented, unremembered children. No headstones, no closure. Just silence and soil. These schools were sites of abuse, neglect, and death. Children died of disease, starvation, beatings, and trauma. Some froze to death trying to escape. Others were never even recorded as missing. The institutions didn't notify families. They simply moved on. Burial was often secret. Accountability non-existent. The mass graves confirmed what Native communities had said for generations. The schools weren't just about assimilation. They were about elimination. Cultural genocide by bureaucratic means. In the U.S., this truth is only beginning to surface. Unlike Canada, where the government launched a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the American response has been muted. But the graves remain. Evidence, accusation, mourning. This isn't ancient history. Survivors are still alive. The trauma is inherited. The pain woven into tribal memory. And with every new grave uncovered, the myth of America's benevolent assimilation cracks further. From poisoned jungles to tortured prisoners to lost children, this is not the history in textbooks. This is the history in bone. And next, we return to where those bones often began, inside company towns designed to control life from cradle to grave. The Pullman Company town. Pullman, Illinois, was supposed to be a model city. Built in the 1880s by George Pullman, the railroad magnate behind the luxurious Pullman sleeping cars, the town was designed as a shining example of industrial paternalism, a utopia for workers. It had manicured lawns, neat brick houses, schools, a library, and even a church. Everything was provided by the company. But there was a catch. Everything was also controlled by the company. Workers paid rent to Pullman, bought groceries from Pullman, went to Pullman-approved schools, read Pullman-approved books, and worshipped in Pullman-sanctioned pews. Wages were modest, but the illusion of stability kept people quiet, until the economy faltered in 1893. As the financial panic spread, Pullman slashed wages while refusing to lower rents or the cost of living in his town. Families struggled to eat. Some were evicted. The town's clean facade began to crack. When workers protested, they were met with indifference. When they struck, they were met with force. The Pullman strike of 1894, fueled in part by these company town conditions, shut down railroads across the nation. The federal government intervened violently, and the strike was crushed. But the town never fully recovered. Eventually, it was absorbed by Chicago, and its reputation as a benevolent experiment was buried under labor history. The Pullman Company town wasn't just about one man's vision. It was a glimpse into how corporations once sought, and still seek, to control not just labor, but life. And when that control is challenged, it can lead to brutal backlash, especially when the workers start fighting back in ways that look like revolution. The Molly Maguires. In the 1870s, deep in Pennsylvania's coal country, fear ran as thick as the coal dust. Miners labored in deadly conditions, barely paid, their lives dictated by mine bosses and railroad tycoons. Most were Irish immigrants, despised for their religion, their accents, and their growing demands for dignity. And some, just a few, were rumored to be part of a secret society, the Molly Maguires. Named after an Irish folk figure, the Molly Maguires operated in the shadows. They allegedly used threats, arson, and assassination against oppressive mine operators and foremen. Murders and sabotage were pinned on them. The Pinkerton Detective Agency was hired to infiltrate their ranks. Undercover agents gained trust, took notes, and waited. In 1876, the hammer dropped. Over 20 men were arrested, tried, and convicted, based largely on the testimony of one Pinkerton agent, James McParland. The trials were murky at best. Evidence was thin. Judges were openly biased. Defense attorneys were harassed. But the verdicts were swift. 19 men were hanged. To some, they were murderers. To others, martyrs. The truth remains obscured by a century of coal dust and fear. But one thing is clear. The trials were less about justice and more about crushing labor resistance. They sent a message to every miner in America. Challenge the hierarchy, and you'll dangle for it. The Molly Maguires became a ghost story for corporate America, whispered whenever workers grew too bold. But in the cities, another kind of ghost was rising. This one dressed in suits, fluent in the language of extortion and blood. The mafia's influence in early 20th century American cities, they called it La Cosa Nostra, our thing. But by the early 20th century, it wasn't just an Italian secret society. It was a shadow government embedded in the veins of American cities: New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, New Orleans. The mafia was everywhere, and they weren't just bootlegging liquor or running numbers. They were reshaping entire economies. Prohibition turned gangsters into kings. With alcohol outlawed, mob families like the Chicago Outfit and the Five Families in New York took over the black market. Speakeasies flourished. Police looked the other way, or got paid to. Violence was frequent. Drive-by shootings, bombings, assassinations in broad daylight. But beneath the bloodshed was a deeper system. The mafia infiltrated labor unions, construction contracts, garbage collection, trucking, restaurants, even politics. City councils were bought, judges were bribed, elections were fixed. If something moved in a city, chances are someone was skimming off it. Law enforcement struggled to keep up. Local police were often compromised. Federal agents were outgunned and outmaneuvered. Even when figures like Al Capone were taken down, it wasn't for murder or racketeering. It was for tax evasion. The real power operated behind layers of intermediaries, silence, and code. But the public was fascinated. Gangsters became celebrities, their violence mythologized, their charisma admired. The line between villain and anti-hero blurred in newsreels and headlines. The mafia didn't just exploit America's underbelly, they helped shape it. And as the nation grew, so did organized crime's reach. The real horror wasn't the gunfire, it was how comfortable everything became. How deeply corruption could root itself when masked by wealth and swagger. And beneath that surface glamour, another horror stalked the land. Not organized crime, but disorganized cruelty. Lynchings carried out by mobs, wrapped in white hoods and hate. The rise of vigilante justice and lynchings, particularly in the post-Civil War South. After the Civil War, the South lost its enslaved labor, but not its commitment to white supremacy. With slavery abolished and black Americans newly enfranchised, white Southerners didn't just resist Reconstruction politically, they weaponized terror. And the most gruesome weapon was lynching. Lynchings weren't just acts of murder. They were spectacles, often public, sometimes advertised, occasionally commemorated with postcards. Crowds would gather. Vendors sold food. Photographers snapped souvenirs. The victims were overwhelmingly black men, accused of crimes without evidence, denied trial, and executed by mob. Some were dragged from jails. Others were taken from their homes. They were beaten, mutilated, hanged, burned alive. Bodies were left on display for days. No one was held accountable. Local authorities either participated or stood by, complicit through silence. The stated reasons were often lies, allegations of theft, or disrespect. The real motive was control. Lynching reinforced a racial caste system. It was meant to remind black communities that their lives could be extinguished on a whim. That freedom didn't mean safety. From 1877 to the 1950s, thousands of lynchings were recorded across the South, and many more likely went undocumented. Activists like Ida B. Wells tried to expose the truth, publishing data, naming names, defying threats. But the federal government refused to act. Anti-lynching bills were proposed repeatedly. They always died in the Senate. Lynching wasn't just a crime. It was a public ritual of dominance, supported by a system that pretended justice while embracing terror. And long before the Civil War ever broke out, there were signs, deep fractures, desperate compromises, and last-ditch efforts to keep the nation stitched together with the threat of slavery. The Crittenden Compromise, 1860. As the United States inched toward disunion in the winter of 1860, Kentucky Senator John J. Crittenden made one final plea. His proposal, the Crittenden Compromise, was a desperate attempt to prevent civil war by appeasing the South. It offered a return to the Missouri Compromise line, extending it westward and constitutionally protecting slavery in southern states and new territories below that line. In short, expand slavery, and maybe we can keep the peace. The proposal was sweeping. It forbade Congress from abolishing slavery in federal jurisdictions. It barred interference with the interstate slave trade, and it was to be enshrined in the Constitution, immune to future amendments. Abraham Lincoln, newly elected, wouldn't bite. The Republican platform opposed any expansion of slavery, and compromising now would undo their entire mandate. Crittenden's plan was rejected. The South saw the writing on the wall. Secession accelerated. By the time Lincoln took office in March 1861, 7 states had already left the Union. The Crittenden Compromise wasn't just a failed plan. It was a snapshot of the political delusion gripping the country. The belief that slavery could still be negotiated, still balanced, even as its moral and political cost tore the nation apart. And while Crittenden tried to write slavery into permanence, the Supreme Court had already carved its stance in stone, declaring in cold legal terms that black lives were not lives at all. The Dred Scott v. Sanford Supreme Court decision, 1857. Dred Scott was a man, not a symbol. An enslaved man who had lived in free states and sued for his freedom, arguing that his residence on free soil had made him free. His case reached the highest court in the land. What he got in return was a verdict that echoed like a curse. In 1857, the Supreme Court ruled 7-2 against Scott. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney declared that black people, free or enslaved, were not citizens and could not sue in federal court. He went further, stating that Congress had no power to regulate slavery in the territories. The Missouri Compromise? Unconstitutional. Slavery, said the court, could legally expand anywhere. The decision wasn't just cruel, it was seismic. It invalidated years of political compromise. It supercharged the abolitionist movement. It radicalized moderates. It made war almost inevitable. Taney's opinion treated Scott not as a man, but as property. It reduced the Constitution to a slaveholder's contract. And in doing so, it confirmed the worst fears of abolitionists, that the highest court in the land was not just indifferent to slavery, it was its enforcer. The Dred Scott decision didn't survive the Civil War. It was obliterated by the 13th and 14th Amendments. But its shadow still looms, a reminder that the law, no matter how sacred, can be wielded as a weapon. That justice can be twisted by prejudice and inked into permanence by power. And as the colonial courts rendered verdicts of superstition and hysteria, the next chapter would see justice traded for fear, where accusations led not to evidence, but to execution. The Salem witch trials, 1692, 1693. It began with a few strange fits. Young girls in Salem Village, screaming, convulsing, claiming to see specters and feel invisible pinches. Doctors couldn't find a cause, so they turned to the supernatural. The result was one of the darkest paroxysms of hysteria in early American history. The Salem witch trials. Between 1692 and 1693, more than 200 people were accused of witchcraft. 19 were hanged. One was pressed to death under heavy stones. Dozens more languished in jail. The victims weren't just practitioners of folk medicine or social outcasts. They were neighbors, wives, slaves, children. Anyone unlucky enough to be caught in the web of suspicion. The trials were fueled by fear, religious extremism, land disputes, and deep social fractures in a rigid Puritan society. Spectral evidence, dreams, visions, and alleged supernatural afflictions was allowed in court. Accusations spread like wildfire, often turning personal vendettas into death sentences. Confession became the only path to survival. Denial often meant execution. And while the village spiraled into chaos, the colonial authorities fumbled. Governor William Phipps eventually shut the trials down after his own wife was implicated. In 1697, a day of fasting and repentance was declared. Judges and jurors expressed regret. But for the dead, it was too late. The Salem witch trials weren't just a Puritan tragedy. They were a template, a warning about the dangers of moral panic, unchecked power, and the weaponization of fear. In Salem, belief killed, and it wouldn't be the last time. Just 70 years later, Another kind of frontier fury would take hold, this time aimed not at witches, but at a peaceful group of Native Americans. The Paxton Boys Massacre, 1763. In the icy December of 1763, a group of Scots-Irish frontiersmen known as the Paxton Boys rode into Pennsylvania's Conestoga Indian town. They were armed, angry, and fueled by rage over recent attacks by native tribes during Pontiac's rebellion. But the Conestoga were peaceful. They had lived under Pennsylvania's protection for decades. That didn't matter. The Paxton Boys slaughtered 6 people in the first attack. The rest of the town's survivors were taken into protective custody in a Lancaster workhouse. 2 weeks later, the Paxton Boys returned. They broke into the workhouse, murdered 14 more, including women and children, and vanished. No arrests were made. No one was punished. Instead, the massacre was excused. The killers were hailed by many settlers as defenders of white security. When the Paxton Boys later marched on Philadelphia to demand the expulsion of all native peoples from the colony, they were met with negotiations, not force. Benjamin Franklin condemned their actions as barbaric. Most others shrugged. The Paxton Boys massacre laid bare the colonial double standard. Native innocence was irrelevant. Fear trumped facts. White settlers saw any indigenous presence as a threat, and violence against them as justified, even heroic. The massacre also exposed the crumbling ideal of Pennsylvania as a haven of tolerance and Quaker pacifism. It marked a turning point, one that signaled the growing acceptance of total war against native populations, even those who posed no threat. And speaking of blood and betrayal, the next American disaster wouldn't come from muskets or mobs, but from the slow gnaw of starvation in a colony clinging to survival. The Great Starvation of Jamestown, 1609-1610, Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in North America. Founded in 1607 on dreams of gold and empire, it quickly became a mud-choked nightmare. Swamps, mosquitoes, brackish water, and poor planning turned the colony into a death trap. But nothing compared to the horror of what settlers later called the starving time. During the winter of 1609-1610, food supplies vanished. Relations with local Powhatan tribes had collapsed. Trade halted. Drought gripped the land. Disease spread. Settlers, already weak from malnutrition, began to die by the dozens. Rats, dogs, snakes, even leather shoes were eaten. And then, in whispered rumors, something worse. Cannibalism. Years later, those rumors would be confirmed. Archaeological digs unearthed the remains of a teenage girl. Her skull and bones bore cut marks, deliberate, practiced, unmistakable. She had been butchered. Of the 500 colonists alive at the start of winter, only about 60 survived by spring. The Great Starvation wasn't just a disaster of bad luck. It was one of arrogance. The colonists had expected riches, not hardship. They arrived with gentlemen unfit for manual labor and leaders obsessed with gold rather than grain. They had ignored indigenous knowledge, overestimated their supplies, and underestimated the land's hostility. The desperation forged a colony willing to survive at any moral cost. It also reinforced the idea that dominance over land, over nature, over native peoples was necessary for survival. It was the earliest whisper of the manifest destiny that would later stretch from sea to sea, and as settlers eventually stabilized and expanded, another expulsion was taking place, this time not of people arriving, but of people being driven out by empire, ocean, and fate. The forced removal of Acadian, Cajun, people from Nova Scotia by the British, 1755, 1764. Before they were Cajuns in the Louisiana Bayou, the Acadians were settlers in Nova Scotia, French-speaking, Catholic, and culturally distinct. Their presence on contested land made them a problem for the British Empire, which viewed them as a potential fifth column in the rising conflict with France. So in 1755, with war simmering and imperial paranoia boiling over, the British made a decision. The Acadians had to go. They called it Le Grand Dérangement, the Great Upheaval. British troops began arresting Acadian men under false pretenses. Families were separated. Homes were burned. Entire villages razed. Over 11,000 Acadians were forcibly removed from their homes and deported across the Atlantic world. Many died en route from disease, starvation, or shipwreck. Some were dumped in British colonies along the eastern seaboard, where they faced hostility, poverty, and continued displacement. Others found their way, years later, to the swamps of Louisiana, where they rebuilt their communities in exile. There, their descendants would become the Cajuns, known for their music, food, and fierce cultural pride. But behind that vibrancy lies a story of exile, betrayal, and survival. The British justified the expulsion by framing the Acadians as disloyal, even though many had tried to remain neutral. In reality, it was about land, religion, and power. It was ethnic cleansing by colonial design, surgical, systematic, and almost forgotten. The Acadian removal serves as a grim prelude to later mass displacements in American history. It shows how empire masks its violence with policy, how homes can become liabilities, and how cultural identity can become a death sentence. And while French Catholics were being scattered, another law was rising in the U.S., one that would turn fugitive freedom into a national obligation, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. In 1850, Congress passed a law that turned the entire United States into a hunting ground. The Fugitive Slave Act wasn't just legislation. It was a declaration that slavery would follow you, no matter where you ran. It mandated that escaped enslaved people be returned to their enslavers, even if they had reached free states. But it went further. It deputized every American citizen. Bystanders were now legally required to assist in capturing fugitives. Federal commissioners were paid more for siding with enslavers than for freeing the accused. There was no trial by jury, no defense, just accusation, seizure, and return. Free Black Americans lived in terror. Kidnappers exploited the system, snatching people off northern streets and selling them into bondage. Protests erupted. Some northern states passed personal liberty laws to resist enforcement. Abolitionists defied the act openly, forming vigilance committees and conducting armed rescues. For the South, it was about property rights. For the North, it became a moral breaking point. The law radicalized moderates, galvanized abolitionists, and turned city squares into battlegrounds over the soul of the nation. The Fugitive Slave Act proved that the federal government wasn't neutral on slavery. It was complicit. It forced citizens to become accessories to human bondage. It made injustice legal, national, and personal. And as that law dug in its heels, another system, larger, more deeply entrenched, continued to grind flesh into profit across an entire economy. The antebellum South's reliance on chattel slavery as its primary economic engine. The antebellum South wasn't just built on slavery, it was slavery. The economy, the politics, the culture, everything revolved around the forced labor of millions of black people treated not as humans, but as capital. Chattel slavery meant permanent, hereditary bondage. Enslaved people were property. They could be bought, sold, mortgaged, leased, and inherited. Their children were born into captivity. Their bodies were commodities, their lives measured in cotton bales, sugarcane yields, and rice harvests. Plantation wealth made Southern elites unimaginably rich. Cotton exports soared. Banks, insurance companies, and shipping firms grew fat on slavery's back. Northern industries profited too. Textile mills, Wall Street financiers, shipping tycoons. The entire nation had blood on its hands. But slavery wasn't just economic, it was ideological. It was defended from pulpits, in courtrooms, and on the floors of Congress. Pseudoscience labeled black people inferior. Religion was twisted into justification. The Southern ruling class believed slavery was not just necessary, but righteous. Meanwhile, enslaved people resisted in every way they could, through work slowdowns, sabotage, escape, literacy, culture, and rebellion. Every act of survival was defiance. Every day lived was a quiet revolution. By the 1850s, the South was locked into slavery like a vice. Any threat to the system was seen as existential. And when the winds of abolition began to rise, the Southern response was not compromise, it was war. But before cannons fired, before battle lines were drawn, Congress tried one last balancing act, an uneasy compromise that only deepened the rift, the Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850 was supposed to be the great balm, the patchwork solution to America's festering wound. It was a legislative bundle wrapped in urgency and contradiction, meant to hold the Union together a little longer. And it worked, briefly. But like most American compromises on slavery, it didn't solve anything. It just spread the infection. Crafted by Henry Clay, brokered by Stephen Douglas, and signed under President Millard Fillmore, the package contained 5 major provisions. California would enter as a free state. The slave trade, not slavery itself, would be abolished in Washington, D.C., Utah, and New Mexico would be allowed to decide on slavery through popular sovereignty. Texas would receive compensation for relinquishing claims to New Mexico. And most explosively, the Fugitive Slave Act would be strengthened. This last part was the ticking time bomb. The compromise was hailed by moderates as a win for both sides. But really, it gave the South everything it needed to entrench slavery deeper into national life. And it gave abolitionists a nightmare to rally against. The newly muscular Fugitive Slave Act made free states de facto enforcers of bondage. It wasn't compromise, it was conquest in slow motion. Far from cooling tensions, the Compromise of 1850 poured gasoline on the fire. It turned everyday citizens into reluctant collaborators or defiant resistors. It helped expose the moral rot at the center of national politics. And when it came time to let the people decide on slavery directly, America saw just how bloody sovereignty could become. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was framed as democratic. In reality, it was a blood-soaked invitation to civil war. Crafted by Senator Stephen Douglas in 1854, the act repealed the Missouri Compromise and opened the territories of Kansas and Nebraska to popular sovereignty, letting settlers vote on whether to allow slavery. Douglas claimed it was about choice, local control, freedom. What he unleashed instead was chaos. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces flooded into Kansas, determined to swing the vote. Elections were rigged. Fraud ran rampant. Armed militias formed. Political speeches turned into gunfire. Homes were burned. Newspapers were destroyed. Bodies piled up in ditches. It became known as Bleeding Kansas. The violence wasn't spontaneous. It was systemic. Border ruffians from Missouri crossed over to intimidate anti-slavery voters. Abolitionist settlers like John Brown responded with their own brand of holy vengeance, famously hacking pro-slavery men to death with broadswords. Kansas wasn't a territory anymore, it was a war zone. Congress, instead of easing tensions, mirrored the chaos. Physical fights broke out on the floor of the Senate. In 1856, Representative Preston Brooks nearly beat Senator Charles Sumner to death with a cane over an anti-slavery speech. Compromise was dead. Dialogue had turned to violence. The Kansas-Nebraska Act didn't just fail. It tore open the national psyche. It showed that slavery wasn't an issue that could be voted away. It would have to be fought over. And as the territories bled, the North began to realize the South wasn't just defending its system. It was preparing for war. But before the armies marched, the Union would strangle its enemy with a slow, cruel choke. The Anaconda Plan. Civil War. The Anaconda Plan wasn't about a quick kill. It was about slow, relentless suffocation. Conceived by Union General Winfield Scott at the outset of the Civil War, it was a strategy of economic warfare. Blockade the South's ports, seize control of the Mississippi River, and squeeze the Confederacy until it couldn't breathe. Critics mocked it at first. It was too slow, too cautious. They wanted blood and glory, not waiting games. But Scott understood something deeper. The South's economy depended on exports, especially cotton, and imports of food, weapons, and supplies. Choke the trade routes, and the rebellion would starve. The blockade, enforced by Union naval power, was massive. It stretched over 3,500 miles of southern coastline. Blockade runners still slipped through, but over time supplies dwindled. Factories shuttered, prices skyrocketed. Desperation took hold. The second phase was even more brutal. By taking control of the Mississippi River, Union forces split the Confederacy in two, severing communication and supply lines between Texas, Arkansas, and the rest of the rebel states. Cities like Vicksburg were besieged and bombarded into submission. It was a death grip that tightened month after month. And while the Anaconda Plan bled the South dry, its effects were most acutely felt not on battlefields, but in homes. Civilians starved. Inflation soared. Desperation mounted. Confederate morale crumbled, not just from bullets, but from hunger and hopelessness. Scott's slow strategy turned out to be devastatingly effective. But even that wasn't enough to break the will of a region built on pride and power. For that, the Union needed fire, needed fury, needed a scorched path through the heart of Dixie. Sherman's March to the Sea, 1864. In late 1864, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman lit a match and dragged it through Georgia. His infamous March to the Sea wasn't just military strategy. It was psychological warfare at its most punishing. Sherman understood that the Civil War couldn't be won with just battlefield victories. The South had to feel the weight of its rebellion in its bones, its homes, its fields, and its future. After capturing Atlanta in September, Sherman cut a swath through Georgia all the way to Savannah, flanked by 60,000 troops and fueled by a doctrine of total war. The aim was to break the Confederacy's will by destroying its capacity to fight and survive. The Army didn't rely on supply lines. It lived off the land, taking what it needed, burning what it didn't. Railroads were torn up and twisted into Sherman's neckties. Crops were torched, livestock slaughtered, warehouses and homes looted, entire towns reduced to ash. Sherman's troops were ordered not to kill civilians, but everything else, property, infrastructure, morale, was fair game. The devastation was staggering. Georgia's agricultural heart was gutted. Slave laborers walked free as plantations crumbled. Confederate forces couldn't keep up or fight back. They were simply bypassed and broken. Sherman's march reached Savannah in December with minimal resistance. To the north, Sherman was a hero. To the south, he was a demon, but his strategy worked. It broke the Confederate backbone and quickened the war's end. Still, the scars didn't heal easily. After the war, Southern narratives turned Sherman into a villain, an avatar of Yankee cruelty. But the truth was colder and more calculated. This was war stripped of romanticism, fought to win. And while Georgia smoldered, another indigenous nation, the Navajo, was being dragged from their homeland, not by fire, but by forced death marches through desolate terrain. The Long Walk of the Navajo, 1864. In 1864, while Sherman carved through the Confederacy, the U.S. government launched a quieter campaign of conquest in the Southwest. The target, the Navajo Nation. The goal, removal, submission, assimilation. What followed was one of the most brutal forced relocations in Native American history, the Long Walk. Years of escalating conflict between the U.S. Army, settlers, and the Navajo had already ravaged the region. The Army, under Colonel Kit Carson, used scorched earth tactics to destroy Navajo homes, orchards, and livestock. Fields were burned, water sources poisoned, entire communities were starved into surrender. With no supplies and no choice, thousands of Navajo were forced to march from their homelands in northeastern Arizona and northwestern New Mexico to the Bosque Redondo Reservation, over 300 miles away, across harsh desert in the dead of winter. They weren't marched once. They were marched again and again in waves. Over 8,000 Navajo endured these treks, many under armed guard. Hundreds died from cold, starvation, and disease. Women gave birth on the trail. Elders collapsed. Children disappeared. The desert took them. Bosque Redondo was a nightmare. Crops failed. The water was brackish and undrinkable. Disease spread like fire. The government offered little support. For 4 long years, the Navajo lived in this open-air prison. Finally, in 1868, the U.S. relented. A treaty was signed. Survivors were allowed to return to a fraction of their ancestral land, broken but unbowed. The Long Walk wasn't just about removal. It was about erasure, of culture, of autonomy, of home. But the Navajo endured. Their return was a quiet act of defiance, their survival a testament to strength in the face of genocidal policy. And while the Navajo limped home, another American city would explode with violence, not from war or conquest, but from labor, bomb blasts, and the ghost of an 8-hour workday. The Haymarket Affair, 1886. Chicago, 1886. The city was a powder keg of industrial unrest. Workers were demanding something radical, an 8-hour workday. Employers pushed back. Police cracked down. And in the chaos of May 4th, during a rally in Haymarket Square, someone threw a bomb. The explosion killed 7 police officers and at least 4 civilians. Gunfire erupted. No one knows who fired first. Chaos ruled. The press screamed anarchist conspiracy. Public hysteria took hold. And the state, eager to crush the labor movement, saw its opportunity. Authorities rounded up 8 anarchists, some of whom hadn't even been at the square. Their crime wasn't proven involvement, but ideology. They were radicals, foreigners, enemies of order. Their trial was a travesty. Evidence was flimsy, testimony contradictory. The judge was biased. The outcome predetermined. 4 men were hanged. 1 killed himself in prison. 3 were later pardoned when a new governor acknowledged the injustice. But the damage was done. The Haymarket Affair became a global symbol of labor's fight, of state repression, and of the price of dissent. In the U.S., it sparked an anti-anarchist backlash. In the world, it became the seed of International Workers' Day. The image of the bomb overshadowed the truth that workers had gathered peacefully for justice and were met with violence, panic, and political theater. Haymarket was not the end. It was a beginning. Because if history shows anything, it's that whenever labor gets loud, capital finds new ways to strike back. Sometimes with lawsuits, sometimes with pink slips, and sometimes with bullets. The Latimer Massacre, 1897, Hazleton, Pennsylvania. A mining town built on coal, sweat, and immigrants. In 1897, its veins ran thick with tension. Slavic, Polish, and Lithuanian miners, new arrivals from Eastern Europe, were the backbone of the region's coal economy. They worked in brutal conditions for starvation wages. Most couldn't even speak English. But they understood when they were being used. When mine owners tried to cut wages again, the workers struck. Peacefully. They marched, unarmed, determined, to support fellow miners in Latimer, who were already on strike. Nearly 400 men walked in columns, their caps tilted low, their signs silent but clear. Dignity or nothing. What greeted them was death. Sheriff James Martin and his deputies confronted the marchers outside Latimer. No warning, no restraint. The deputies opened fire. A storm of bullets tore into the crowd. 19 miners were killed, many shot in the back as they fled. Dozens more were wounded, all of them immigrants, none of them armed. The massacre shocked the nation, but not enough. The deputies were arrested and put on trial. Every one of them was acquitted. Latimer wasn't just a tragedy, it was a message. To immigrants, your life is cheap. To labor, your blood is expendable. To capital, the state is on your side. Yet the miners didn't back down. The massacre gave momentum to the growing labor movement. It galvanized union organizing across the region. It lit a fire under workers who saw, in every bullet hole, the cost of silence. And that fire would keep burning. Just a few years later, in another town with another name, it would explode again, this time in a courtroom, in a hail of bullets, and in a town called Centralia. The Centralia Massacre, 1919, November 11th, 1919, Armistice Day. In Centralia, Washington, a parade of American Legion members marched through town to celebrate the end of World War I. But tensions simmered beneath the flags and music. The industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies, had a hall in Centralia, and they were hated by local elites and veterans alike, accused of being radicals, traitors, anti-American. As the parade neared the Union Hall, shots rang out. Chaos erupted. Legionnaires rushed the building. From inside, Wobblies fired back. 4 Legionnaires were killed. 1 Wobbly was lynched. Wesley Everest, a veteran himself, dragged from jail, hung from a bridge, his body riddled with bullets. Who fired first remains disputed, but the aftermath was swift and one-sided. Wobblies were arrested en masse, beaten, and put on trial for murder. 8 were convicted. The Legionnaires who stormed the hall, never charged. The Centralia Massacre revealed the raw nerve of post-war America, a country that had just defeated tyranny abroad and was now eager to crush dissent at home. Labor unrest was painted as treason. Unionists were treated as enemies. Patriotism was rebranded as uniform obedience. It also showed how easily truth becomes a casualty. The official narrative demonized the Wobblies, ignoring the violence aimed at them before the shooting even started. The lynching of Everest was barely mentioned. The press turned radicals into monsters, and fear into law. But the story didn't vanish. Centralia became a grim chapter in labor history, proof that the war for workers' rights wasn't just about hours and wages. It was about survival. And as the nation struggled with radicals in the North, it would soon erupt in violence again. This time not along class lines, but race. Welcome to Los Angeles, 1943. Enter the Zoot Suit. The Zoot Suit Riots, 1943. They came in white uniforms and military swagger. The attackers weren't gang members or vigilantes. They were U.S. servicemen swarming the streets of Los Angeles in June 1943. Looking for young Mexican Americans wearing zoot suits, flashy, oversized, and in their eyes, un-American. The Zoot Suit riots were less about fashion and more about fear, of youth, of rebellion, of brown bodies in a city still segregated by invisible borders. Tensions had been building. The Sleepy Lagoon murder trial had already demonized Chicano youth as violent and criminal. The press stoked the fire, and then it ignited. For nearly a week, white servicemen roamed the city, tearing zoot suits off teenagers, beating them in the streets, stripping them naked, and leaving them bleeding. The police, they arrested the victims. The city, it banned zoot suits as if the clothes, not the hatred, were the problem. The violence spread beyond Mexican Americans. Black and Filipino youths were also attacked. It was a free-for-all of racialized vengeance, cloaked in patriotism and wartime anxiety. The government, desperate to maintain order on the home front, downplayed the riots, blamed the gangs, ignored the racism. But for the young men brutalized on the sidewalks of L.A., the message was clear. Your country doesn't see you. It sees your skin, your swagger, your suit, and it hates what it fears. The Zoot Suit riots weren't isolated. They were a mirror. They showed the fault lines of wartime America, the hypocrisy of fighting fascism abroad while enforcing segregation at home. And they marked the beginning of a long, fiery reckoning, a reckoning that would boil over 2 decades later in South Central. The Watts Riots, 1965. On August 11, 1965, in the heart of Los Angeles, a traffic stop ignited a firestorm. It began when Marquette Fry, a 21-year-old black man, was pulled over for suspected drunk driving. A scuffle broke out between Fry, his family, and police officers. The crowd watching the scene grew restless, then furious. The streets of Watts, already choking under poverty, discrimination, and police brutality, exploded. For 6 days, the neighborhood burned. What started as outrage over a single arrest became a full-blown rebellion. Stores were looted. Buildings were torched. Police were overwhelmed. The National Guard rolled in with rifles and tanks. Over 30 people were killed. More than 1,000 injured. Property damage climbed into the tens of millions. But this wasn't just chaos. It was catharsis. A scream from a community long ignored, beaten down, and pushed aside. The Watts riots weren't spontaneous. They were the result of decades of systemic neglect. Segregation was unofficial but real. Jobs were scarce. Schools were underfunded. Police treated black residents as suspects first, citizens never. Watts was a pressure cooker, and that night in August, the lid finally blew off. Politicians condemned the violence. Reporters marveled at the destruction. But few addressed the root causes. In truth, Watts wasn't just about rage, it was about visibility, about making pain impossible to ignore. And that pain would only deepen as the years went on. Just 2 years later, another American city, bigger, more industrial, just as combustible, would erupt in flames of its own. And the cost would be even higher. The Detroit riots, 1967. Detroit, July 1967. The Motor City was already on edge. Racial inequality, police aggression, economic despair, all had pushed the city's black residents to a breaking point. That breaking point came when police raided an unlicensed bar in a black neighborhood, arresting 82 people who were celebrating the return of 2 Vietnam veterans. As police loaded people into paddy wagons, a crowd gathered. The mood turned, bottles flew, then bricks. Within hours, Detroit was engulfed. The 1967 Detroit riots lasted 5 days. It became one of the deadliest and most destructive civil disturbances in U.S. history. Entire blocks were torched. Snipers perched on rooftops. Looters ransacked stores. Tanks rolled through the city. Over 40 people died, most of them black residents. Thousands were injured and arrested. Tens of thousands were left without homes or businesses. The National Guard and the U.S. Army were called in. Still, the fires spread. Smoke clouded the skyline. Police shot civilians under flimsy justifications. The city looked like a war zone, because in many ways it was. The causes weren't mysterious. The Kerner Commission, formed in the aftermath, laid it out clearly. Systemic racism, unchecked police brutality, economic apartheid, a tale as old as America and just as unresolved. Detroit never fully recovered. The city's population hemorrhaged. White flight accelerated. Disinvestment followed. The scars of '67 are still etched into the city's geography and its psyche, and the pain didn't stop. Because just a year later, hope itself was assassinated, and the country learned that even dreams, when spoken too loudly, could be silenced by a bullet. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., 1968, and the subsequent riots, April 4, 1968, Memphis, Tennessee. Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. He was there to support striking sanitation workers. He spoke of unity, of justice, of the promised land. And then he was shot. The bullet didn't just kill a man. It ruptured the soul of a nation. Within hours, cities across the United States erupted in grief and rage. Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Chicago, Kansas City, and dozens more burned. Over 100 cities, tens of thousands arrested, curfews imposed. The National Guard deployed. More than 40 people were killed, most of them black. These weren't just riots, they were funerals for hope. King had been a nonviolent prophet, a moral compass in a country that couldn't stop spinning. His death signaled that even peaceful resistance wasn't safe, that no amount of dignity or restraint could protect a black leader from an assassin's bullet. In the chaos, some communities lashed out. Others mourned in silence. But all understood. Something irreversible had happened. America had lost its conscience. President Lyndon Johnson called for calm, but offered little change. The civil rights legislation that followed was piecemeal, symbolic. The deeper rot, poverty, racism, policing, remained untouched. King's assassination marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Gone was the optimism of the early 60s. In its place, disillusionment, black power, militant self-defense, and an America drifting further from its promises. And as one Kennedy eulogized King, another would soon face the same fate, an echo of violence in a country where even dreams come with crosshairs. The assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, 1968, just months after MLK Jr.'s death. It was supposed to be a comeback. Robert F. Kennedy, younger brother of JFK, had reemerged as a symbol of healing in a nation unraveling. His voice resonated with the poor, the disenfranchised, the war-weary. He spoke to black communities not with condescension, but with compassion. After Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, it was Bobby who calmed angry cities with words instead of force. Then came June 5, 1968, Los Angeles. Just after midnight, Kennedy stood in the kitchen pantry of the Ambassador Hotel, having just declared victory in the California Democratic primary. He was shaking hands, smiling, hopeful, and then, gunshots. Sirhan Sirhan, a 24-year-old Palestinian immigrant, fired multiple rounds at close range. RFK was hit several times. He collapsed, bleeding on the floor, whispering, "Is everybody all right?" He died the next day. The nation was again plunged into grief. Two beloved Kennedys gone within 5 years. Two symbols of a better America cut down before their visions could fully materialize. And with King also gone, the void was devastating. RFK's death was more than personal tragedy. It was political decapitation. He had the rare ability to connect across racial and class divides. Many believed he could have won the presidency. His absence left the Democratic Party fractured and rudderless. 1968 was already soaked in violence and rage. Kennedy's assassination closed the door on optimism and ushered in an age of hard cynicism. It was the year when America's post-war dream truly died. But even as grief settled in, violence didn't pause. In the Deep South, the cities were still burning. In the North, the campuses were getting louder. And in Florida, another explosion of racial fury was about to flash into view. The Gainesville riots, 1970. Gainesville, Florida, 1970. It wasn't supposed to happen here. A sleepy college town, home to the University of Florida, seemed far from the racial tensions and anti-war fervor shaking other cities. But anger has no borders, and silence can be just as volatile. In the weeks following the Kent State shootings, where 4 white students were gunned down by National Guardsmen during a Vietnam War protest, campuses across the country were on edge. In Gainesville, protests erupted, not just over the war, but over the ongoing racial inequalities that defined everyday life for black residents. White students and black residents clashed. Buildings were vandalized. Police responded with batons and tear gas. The violence wasn't as deadly as in other cities, but it was significant. It showed that the line between the civil rights struggle and the anti-war movement was blurring, and that racial unrest wasn't limited to urban centers. The riots in Gainesville weren't just about Vietnam or Kent State. They were about housing discrimination, police brutality, economic exclusion. They were about a town pretending to be neutral while inequality festered beneath the magnolia trees. The local government cracked down. Protesters were surveilled. Leaders were arrested. The white establishment doubled down on law and order, but the fire had been lit. Gainesville became another data point in the rising tide of domestic unrest, where universities were no longer safe havens and small towns no longer immune. And while Gainesville's violence simmered, a new threat was growing, not from below, but from the shadows. A new kind of terrorism was emerging. White hoods were being traded for tactical gear. The battleground wasn't just racial or ideological. It was going underground. The rise of domestic terrorism by white supremacist and anti-government groups in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. As the 20th century waned, America's most dangerous threats didn't always come from overseas. They were born and bred right here, steeped in conspiracy, anger, and the burning conviction that the government was the enemy. White supremacist militias, neo-Nazis, Christian identity sects, anti-government sovereign citizens. These weren't fringe weirdos with homemade bunkers. They were part of a coordinated ecosystem of hate. They trained, they recruited, they armed themselves. Waco, Ruby Ridge, the Freeman Standoff. These flashpoints weren't isolated. They were calls to arms. Fueled by Y2K paranoia, economic anxiety, and racial resentment, these groups saw themselves as patriots reclaiming a corrupted nation. And they didn't just talk. They acted. Armed standoffs, bomb plots, assassination attempts, training camps hidden in rural compounds, propaganda disguised as patriotism. The internet supercharged it all. Forums became echo chambers. Lone wolves were radicalized with every click. And then came April 19th, 1995. Oklahoma City. A bombing that would rip through the heart of the nation and prove once and for all that domestic terror didn't need a foreign passport. It just needed rage, fertilizer, and a twisted ideology. The Oklahoma City bombing, 1995. At 9:02 a.m. on April 19, 1995, downtown Oklahoma City was shattered by a blast so powerful it left a crater 30 feet wide. The target was the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. The weapon, a Ryder rental truck packed with ammonium nitrate fertilizer and fuel oil. The death toll, 168 lives, including 19 children in a daycare center. Hundreds more were injured. Glass exploded across blocks. Cars melted. Faces were forever changed. The man behind the attack, Timothy McVeigh, was a decorated Gulf War veteran. But he wasn't fighting foreign enemies. He was at war with his own government, fueled by a toxic blend of anti-government ideology, conspiracy theories, and revenge for the Waco siege 2 years earlier. McVeigh saw himself as a soldier of liberty. In reality, he was a domestic terrorist, one of the deadliest in U.S. history. The bombing wasn't just an attack on a building. It was a statement. McVeigh hoped it would inspire others to rise up against federal authority. Instead, it horrified the nation. Rescue workers pulled infants from rubble. Survivors walked out bleeding, shell-shocked. The country watched in silence as the cost of radicalization became horrifyingly clear. And yet, even as the nation grieved, the warnings went unheeded. Militia groups weren't dismantled. The far-right underground didn't disappear. It simply adapted, waited, rebranded. McVeigh was executed in 2001, but the ideology that birthed him never died. It only multiplied, laying the foundation for an entire era of homegrown extremism. Before the country could fully process this trauma, another standoff had already left its mark. An inferno broadcast live on national television, with a body count that would haunt the American psyche. The Branch Davidian Siege, 1993. Waco, Texas, February 28, 1993. Federal agents from the ATF launched a raid on a religious compound just outside the city. Their target, David Koresh, leader of the Branch Davidians. The allegations, stockpiling illegal weapons and abusing minors. The result? A shootout that left 4 agents and 6 Davidians dead and ignited a siege that would last 51 days. Inside the Mount Carmel compound were more than 100 people, including children. Outside, the FBI surrounded them with tanks, helicopters, and spotlights. Negotiations dragged on for weeks. The standoff was a media circus, a political firestorm, and a ticking bomb. Koresh claimed to be a messianic figure. His followers believed the end of the world was imminent. As pressure mounted, The FBI grew impatient. On April 19th, the same day McVeigh would later choose for his bombing, they moved in with tear gas. The compound caught fire. Whether it was sparked by the FBI or the Davidians remains debated. The flames consumed everything. 76 people died, including 25 children. Charred bodies were found in bunkers and prayer rooms. The country watched in horror. What had started as a law enforcement operation ended in a massacre. The Waco siege became a rallying cry for the far right. It confirmed every paranoid fantasy about government tyranny. Militias multiplied. Anti-government rhetoric went mainstream. And among them was McVeigh, who visited the site and later cited it as his justification for mass murder. Waco wasn't just a tragedy. It was a turning point. It exposed the limits of state power, the fragility of civil liberties, and the dangerous allure of martyrdom. It set the stage for future clashes between ideology and authority. And speaking of standoffs gone radioactive, there was one before Waco that put a sniper in the trees, a mother in the doorway, and a nation on edge. The Ruby Ridge Standoff, 1992, Northern Idaho, 1992. A cabin in the mountains, a man named Randy Weaver, a family trying to live off the grid, and a federal government ready to flex its might. What happened at Ruby Ridge wasn't just a standoff. It was the prelude to a movement. Weaver, a former Green Beret with white separatist beliefs, had been charged with selling illegal firearms. When he failed to appear in court, federal agents staked out his property. What followed was an 11-day siege that spiraled into disaster. On August 21st, U.S. Marshals encountered the Weaver family's teenage son, Sammy, and a family friend in the woods. Shots were fired. Sammy was killed. The family's dog was shot dead. The next day, FBI snipers arrived. One of them shot Weaver in the back. Then, as his wife Vicky stood in the doorway holding their baby, she was killed by a bullet through the head. The siege became a national scandal. Public outrage erupted. Congressional hearings followed. The rules of engagement used by the FBI were found to be unconstitutional. Apologies were issued, settlements paid, but the damage to lives, trust, and the national psyche was done. Ruby Ridge radicalized a generation. It became holy scripture for anti-government groups, a symbol of federal overreach, a martyrdom myth. McVeigh again watched, listened, took notes. He wasn't alone. The ghosts of Ruby Ridge, Waco, and Oklahoma City haunt the American story. But they also form a thread, a warning that in the void of trust, ideology becomes gasoline. And the match is always waiting. But not all dangerous plans came from outside the government. Sometimes the most chilling blueprints are drawn from within. The Northwoods Operation, 1962. The plan was called Operation Northwoods, and it was real. In 1962, amidst the high-tension chess game of the Cold War, the U.S. Department of Defense, specifically the Joint Chiefs of Staff, drafted a set of proposals so extreme they read like the plot of a dystopian thriller. The idea: conduct acts of terrorism against American citizens, and then blame them on Cuba. The objective was to justify a U.S. invasion of Fidel Castro's regime. The means? Stunningly cynical. The Northwoods documents outlined fake hijackings, staged bombings, fabricated casualties, and even mock funerals for non-existent victims. American planes shot down by American pilots. Innocent civilians put at risk, or worse, for political theater. One plan called for a drone aircraft to be painted as a civilian passenger jet, filled with dummies, and shot down over Cuban waters. Another suggested setting off bombs in Miami and blaming pro-Castro groups. And all of it was designed to whip the American public into a war-ready frenzy. The proposals were signed and ready to go, but to his credit, President John F. Kennedy rejected the plan outright. He refused to let the military manufacture consent through blood and deceit. Operation Northwoods was shelved, never approved, but it existed, on paper, in serious consideration, within the highest echelons of government. The documents were declassified decades later, sparking a mix of outrage and disbelief. If this is what they were willing to write down, what else had they done? Northwoods didn't lead to war, but it did expose a chilling truth. The line between national security and national betrayal can be frighteningly thin. And sometimes, the wounds left by such betrayals linger long after the documents are locked away. And even when the operation is denied, the fallout doesn't always disappear, because a few decades later, that same administration, different names, different enemies, would trade arms for hostages and secrets for cash. The Iran-Contra affair's long-term damage to public trust in government. The 1980s were loud. Neon, cocaine, capitalism, and Cold War chess matches. But underneath the pop and fizz, something darker was brewing in the shadowy backrooms of Reagan-era Washington. A scandal that would expose a web of deceit so tangled it nearly unraveled the credibility of the presidency. At the center was the Iran-Contra affair. Here's the setup. Congress had passed the Boland Amendment, which banned U.S. assistance to the Contras, a right-wing rebel group fighting the socialist Sandinista government in Nicaragua. But the Reagan administration, obsessed with rolling back communism, wasn't about to let a little law get in the way. So they did what any morally flexible power structure would do. They went around it. The plan? Sell arms to Iran, a country labeled a sponsor of terrorism, one the U.S. had no formal relations with, in exchange for the release of American hostages held in Lebanon. Then funnel the profits to the Contras in Nicaragua. Illegal, unethical, and completely off the books. When it was exposed, the fallout was seismic. Congressional hearings were held. Key figures like Oliver North and John Poindexter took the stand. The phrase, "I do not recall," echoed through the chamber like a mantra of plausible deniability. Ronald Reagan claimed he had no knowledge. George H.W. Bush, who would later pardon several key players, sidestepped implications. And the American public, already growing weary of backdoor deals and Cold War paranoia, was left with one overwhelming takeaway: the government lies. The long-term damage wasn't just legal, it was psychological. Trust in government cratered. The myth of American moral high ground eroded. Iran-Contra didn't just show that laws could be bent. It showed they could be shattered in silence. And as America wrestled with what had been done in its name, the scars weren't just political. They were institutional, cultural, permanent. But not all disasters come from conspiracy. Some are born in plain view, in full color on live TV, and 73 seconds after liftoff. The Challenger disaster, 1986. January 28, 1986. The shuttle Challenger lifted off from Cape Canaveral in front of millions watching live. On board were 7 astronauts, including Krista McAuliffe, a high school teacher who was to become the first civilian in space. It was supposed to be a moment of triumph, a moment of unity. Instead, it became tragedy etched in slow-motion horror. 73 seconds after liftoff, the shuttle disintegrated. The cause? A faulty O-ring in one of the solid rocket boosters. It failed in the cold morning temperatures, causing a leak of hot gas that ignited the fuel tank. The shuttle didn't explode in the Hollywood sense. It broke apart, torn by aerodynamic forces, scattering debris and lives across the Atlantic. What followed was collective national trauma. Children had watched the launch in classrooms. Families screamed at television screens. The image of the shuttle's trail splitting into twin plumes became iconic and sickening. But the real horror was this: it could have been prevented. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the contractor responsible for the booster, had warned NASA about the O-ring's performance in cold weather. They begged to delay the launch. NASA overruled them, under pressure to maintain its ambitious flight schedule. An investigation followed. The Rogers Commission uncovered systemic failures, communication breakdowns, bureaucratic arrogance, a culture of silencing dissent. It wasn't just a mechanical failure, it was a leadership failure. Challenger changed spaceflight forever. The shuttle program was grounded for almost 3 years. The mythology of infallible American engineering cracked wide open, and Krista McAuliffe, once a symbol of inspiration, became a martyr of institutional negligence. The Challenger didn't just fall from the sky, it fell from grace, and with it, a nation's blind trust in its own ambition. And as America mourned the astronauts, another countdown was already ticking, one that would break hearts, burn up on re-entry, and remind us that even second chances carry no guarantees. The Columbia disaster, 2003. 17 years after Challenger, the sky betrayed America again. On February 1st, 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia was scheduled to return home after a successful 16-day mission. It had orbited Earth 255 times. Its crew of 7 astronauts, men and women from varied backgrounds, including the first Indian-born woman in space, Kalpana Chawla, had completed research, floated weightless, and sent smiles back to Earth. All that remained was a smooth descent. Instead, Columbia disintegrated over Texas and Louisiana. The cause was heartbreakingly familiar: avoidable engineering failure. During launch, a piece of insulating foam broke off from the external fuel tank and struck the leading edge of the shuttle's left wing. NASA had seen foam shedding before, but in a culture again shaped by bureaucracy and overconfidence, the risk was downplayed. That missing chunk allowed superheated gases to penetrate the wing during re-entry. The shuttle's internal structure was shredded from the inside. The astronauts never stood a chance. Debris rained over hundreds of miles. The silence after the explosion was as deafening as the boom. America had once again witnessed the limits of its spacefaring ambition. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board pointed to the same ghosts that haunted Challenger: systemic management failures, poor risk assessment, and a culture that prized schedule over safety. But Columbia's loss went beyond technology. The crew represented a vision of global cooperation and scientific curiosity. Their deaths weren't just a national tragedy. They were a global wound. NASA's shuttle program never fully recovered. And in Columbia's shadow, faith in progress became a more cautious, bruised thing. Humanity's reach had again exceeded its grasp. Still, the sky wasn't the only place where disaster was brewing. Below ground, in Pennsylvania, a different kind of threat was bubbling. One invisible, silent, and radioactive. The 3 Mile Island accident, 1979. March 28, 1979. 3 Mile Island Nuclear Generating Station, Pennsylvania. Reactor number 2 suffered a partial meltdown, the most serious accident in U.S. commercial nuclear power history. It started with a malfunction in the non-nuclear secondary system, compounded by human error, equipment failure, and poorly designed control rooms. Cooling systems failed. Temperatures soared. Radioactive gases were released into the environment. The worst didn't happen, the core didn't explode, but it came terrifyingly close. For hours, conflicting reports and official vagueness left the public in a state of panic. Confusion turned to dread. Residents fled. Schools closed. The media descended. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Evacuation orders loomed. For days, Americans lived on the edge of an invisible disaster. What 3 Mile Island revealed wasn't just the fragility of nuclear technology, but the fragility of trust. Officials struggled to communicate. The utility company, Metropolitan Edison, downplayed the severity. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission seemed overwhelmed. Americans realized that a single equipment failure could potentially render entire regions uninhabitable. No one died, no immediate injuries, but the psychological fallout was immense. The anti-nuclear movement surged. Confidence in nuclear energy plummeted. Future reactor projects were scrapped. Hollywood piled on with the eerily timed release of The China Syndrome, a fictional meltdown film released just days before the real-life event. 3 Mile Island didn't just mark a technological failure, it marked the death of an energy dream. Nuclear power had been sold as clean, limitless, and safe. Now it was suspect, tainted, fear-glazed. And while the public focused on isotopes and containment domes, another disaster was already brewing in an American suburb. This one more intimate, more chemical, and buried beneath white picket fences. The Love Canal disaster, 1978. It began with the smell. In Love Canal, a seemingly quiet suburb of Niagara Falls, New York, kids played in backyards while parents planted gardens, never suspecting they were living atop a toxic graveyard. Beneath their homes and schools lay 21,000 tons of industrial waste, dumped by Hooker Chemical Company and buried in the 1940s. By the late 1970s, chemicals began surfacing, literally. Black sludge bubbled up in basements. Puddles in driveways stung the skin. Children fell mysteriously ill. Women reported miscarriages and birth defects. Pets died. The horror wasn't fast. It was insidious, and it was everywhere. Residents raised alarms. Officials dismissed concerns. The local government accused them of paranoia. It wasn't until investigative journalists and grassroots activism forced the issue into the spotlight that the truth became impossible to deny. The neighborhood was declared a disaster zone. Hundreds of families were evacuated. Entire blocks abandoned. The government eventually bought out homes. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, got involved, but it was too late to erase the betrayal. Love Canal became the face of environmental negligence in America. It showed how corporations could poison communities and how the government could fail to stop them. It led to the creation of the Superfund program, a federal effort to clean up hazardous waste sites. But the cleanup was always reactive. The damage, biological, psychological, communal, had already taken root. The suburban dream had rotted from underneath. And Love Canal was just the beginning. Because elsewhere, another American corporation was preparing to break records, not in profits, but in body counts. The Bhopal disaster, 1984, though affecting a U.S. company. At exactly 12:40 a.m. on December 3, 1984, the air over Bhopal, India, turned to poison. A cloud of methyl isocyanate gas, over 40 tons of it, leaked from a pesticide plant owned by Union Carbide, an American corporation. What followed was the deadliest industrial accident in history. People awoke choking, clawing at their throats, blinded by chemicals. They ran from their homes, only to collapse in the streets. Mothers lost children in their arms. Entire families perished before dawn. Estimates vary, but it's believed that between 3,000 and 10,000 people died within the first 72 hours. Over 500,000 were exposed. Decades later, the death toll continues to climb from cancers, respiratory diseases, birth defects, and lingering contamination. The plant had been operating on the cheap. Safety protocols were ignored. Warning systems were broken or silenced. The night shift had no idea the killer gas was escaping into the slums surrounding the factory. Union Carbide executives back in the U.S. would later claim sabotage, but an independent investigation revealed a much darker truth: corporate negligence. The Bhopal disaster was a catastrophe shaped by colonial economics, Western industry outsourcing danger to poorer, more expendable communities. Union Carbide fled responsibility, even as victims begged for medical help, for clean water, for justice. Their CEO, Warren Anderson, was charged with manslaughter in India. He never stood trial. The site remains toxic to this day. And as Bhopal showed how American corporations could poison a city abroad, another American disaster would reveal how a single accident could bleed into the oceans, devastate ecosystems, and prove that no frontier, land, sea, or air, is immune to greed. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill, 2010, April 20th, 2010. The Deepwater Horizon drilling rig, owned by Transocean and leased by British Petroleum, BP, exploded in the Gulf of Mexico. 11 workers were killed. Flames towered into the sky. 2 days later, the rig sank. But that was just the beginning. From the seafloor, nearly a mile down, crude oil gushed unchecked for 87 straight days. By the time the well was capped, an estimated 210 million gallons of oil had leaked into the Gulf. It was the largest marine oil spill in history. Dead zones bloomed. Fish and shrimp populations collapsed. Dolphins washed ashore, coated in sludge. Pelicans flapped helplessly, tarred and grounded. BP initially downplayed the damage, then they denied it. Then they threw billions at it. Cleanup crews, media campaigns, court settlements. But the damage was done. Economically, the fishing and tourism industries in Gulf states were crippled. Ecologically, the effects are still unfolding. The cause? Corner-cutting, cost-cutting, and overconfidence. Just weeks before the explosion, the rig had failed safety tests. Engineers knew the blowout preventer, designed to stop exactly this kind of disaster, was faulty. But deadlines loomed. Profits dictated the pace. So they drilled. Investigations revealed a culture of negligence, both corporate and regulatory. The disaster wasn't a fluke. It was engineered by complacency. BP paid over $60 billion in fines and settlements. But to communities that lost livelihoods, and to a sea that still bears the scars, it wasn't nearly enough. And if Deepwater Horizon represented financial ruin wrapped in ecological collapse, then what came next would show that even on land, with suits instead of drills, corporations could build their empires on illusions and bring the entire economy crashing down. The Enron scandal, 2001. Enron wasn't just a company, it was a mirage. A Wall Street darling, a corporate juggernaut, in the face of innovation. Until it all fell apart. Founded in the mid-1980s, Enron transformed from a sleepy natural gas pipeline company into an energy trading behemoth. They created complex financial instruments, traded virtual commodities, and sold themselves as the future. CEOs Kenneth Lay and Jeffrey Skilling were media rock stars. Their stock soared. Investors were hooked. Enron was hailed as the most innovative company in America, 6 years running. But behind the curtain was a web of fraud. To maintain their stock price, Enron used accounting tricks to hide debt and inflate profits. They created shell companies to carry liabilities off the books. Executives cashed out while the house of cards teetered. Employees were told to keep buying stock. Then, in late 2001, the truth leaked out. Within weeks, Enron declared bankruptcy, the largest in U.S. history at the time. Thousands of employees lost their jobs, savings, and pensions. Shareholders were wiped out. Arthur Andersen, one of the largest accounting firms in the world, was complicit and collapsed with it. The scandal rocked Wall Street. It exposed the cracks in corporate governance and the failure of regulators. Congress scrambled to respond. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act was passed to improve transparency and accountability in corporate reporting. But for many, the damage was already done. Enron wasn't just a scam. It was a symptom of unchecked greed, of a culture that rewards short-term gains over long-term stability. And as the smoke cleared, Americans wondered, if a titan like Enron could be fake, what else was built on sand? The answer would come just 7 years later. Only this time, it wasn't just one company. It was the entire financial system. The Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme, 2008. Bernie Madoff was the kind of man who made trust look profitable. A respected financier, former NASDAQ chairman, and country club regular, Madoff ran an investment firm that seemed too good to be true. And that's because it was. For decades, Madoff promised consistent, market-defying returns. Whether the Dow soared or plummeted, his clients always came out ahead. Investors flocked to him. Not just average retirees, but celebrities, hedge funds, universities, even philanthropic organizations. He was the gold standard of safety. Behind the curtain, nothing. No trades, no investments, just a classic Ponzi scheme, using new investors' money to pay off old ones. When the 2008 financial crisis hit and clients tried to cash out, the illusion collapsed. In total, Madoff had swindled investors out of an estimated $65 billion, making it the largest Ponzi scheme in history. Families were ruined. Charities shuttered. Generations of savings vanished. Some victims, devastated by the betrayal, took their own lives. Madoff was arrested and sentenced to 150 years in prison. But the damage stretched far beyond him. The scandal exposed deep failures in regulatory oversight. The Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, had received warnings for years, detailed reports that were ignored. Whistleblowers were dismissed. Madoff didn't just fool the public. He fooled the people paid to watch him. His fall became symbolic of the greed and recklessness that defined a financial era. But as shocking as Madoff's scam was, it was just the tip of the iceberg, because right as he was being arrested, a much larger financial tsunami was about to hit. One that didn't just swindle investors, but nearly broke the global economy. The subprime mortgage crisis and the 2008 financial meltdown. Imagine lending $1 million mansion to someone with no income, no job, no assets, and then betting that they'll pay you back. Welcome to the American housing market circa 2005. In the years leading up to the crash, banks and mortgage lenders handed out home loans like candy, especially to subprime borrowers with poor credit. Why? Because they didn't plan on holding the loans. Instead, they bundled them into complex financial products called mortgage-backed securities and sold them to investors around the world. The ratings agencies gave these bundles AAA ratings. Wall Street created derivatives like collateralized debt obligations, CDOs, and credit default swaps, essentially insurance policies on doomed investments. It was a financial house of mirrors, where no one knew what was real and everyone pretended it was safe. Then reality hit. Homeowners began defaulting en masse. Housing prices plummeted. Those mortgage-backed securities turned toxic. Banks were left holding worthless paper. Lehman Brothers collapsed. Bear Stearns disappeared. AIG was bailed out. The Dow Jones plunged. Trillions in global wealth evaporated. Panic swept through the financial system like a virus. Credit froze. Companies slashed jobs. Foreclosures exploded. Ordinary Americans lost homes, jobs, retirement savings, everything. The Great Recession had arrived. In response, the government bailed out the banks with taxpayer money. Too big to fail became the defining phrase of the era. And while Wall Street stabilized, Main Street never fully recovered. Executives walked away with bonuses. Millions of Americans never walked back into their homes. The crisis exposed the rot at the core of modern capitalism. An ecosystem where risk was offloaded, profits were privatized, and losses were socialized. It was a man-made disaster, not an accident. And speaking of disasters, there was one still unfolding in real time. One where neglect wasn't hidden in spreadsheets, but pouring out of faucets. The Flint water crisis, 2014 present, it began with a switch. In 2014, the city of Flint, Michigan changed its water source from Detroit's system to the Flint River. The move was meant to save money. Instead, it cost lives. The Flint River was highly corrosive, but officials failed to treat it with proper anti-corrosion chemicals. The result? Lead from aging pipes leached into the water supply. Residents noticed immediately. Discoloration, foul taste, skin rashes. But when they complained, they were dismissed. For months, state and local officials insisted the water was safe. They mocked residents, ignored warnings from doctors, and falsified reports. Meanwhile, children were drinking lead-tainted water. Pregnant women were exposed. The long-term neurological damage? Incalculable. By the time the truth came out, the damage had been done. Tens of thousands of people had been poisoned. Flint, a majority black and low-income city, became a symbol of environmental racism and governmental betrayal. Investigations followed. Officials resigned. Some were charged. Bottled water was distributed. But the pipes? They remained. The trust? Gone. Even years later, many Flint residents still rely on bottled water. The scars, both physical and psychological, haven't healed. And while headlines faded, the crisis didn't. It's still happening, because fixing pipes is one thing. Fixing a broken system of neglect and denial is something else entirely. And in Flint, that system wasn't a bug. It was the feature. A cold, calculated decision to save dollars at the expense of human lives. But the roots of that betrayal, they go deeper, all the way down to a government that once believed even war itself should be put to a vote. The Ludlow Amendment, 1930s, 1940s. Before war became something declared on Twitter or launched with drones from thousands of miles away, there was a moment in American history when the public seriously asked, what if war had to go through us first? Enter the Ludlow Amendment. Proposed repeatedly during the 1930s and early 1940s by Congressman Lewis Ludlow of Indiana, this constitutional amendment would have required a national referendum before the United States could declare war, except in cases of direct invasion or attack. Think of it as crowdsourced war authorization. The people, not just politicians, would hold the trigger, and Americans loved it. Coming off the blood-soaked heels of World War I and drifting into the Great Depression, the U.S. public had grown deeply skeptical of foreign entanglements. The Nye Committee had just exposed how arms manufacturers and financiers profited from Wobbyun, fueling the belief that wars weren't fought for freedom. They were fought for profit. At its height, the Ludlow Amendment had support from nearly 75% of Americans. Editorials praised it. Town halls buzzed with support. It made isolationism look like common sense, not cowardice. But the political class wasn't having it. President Franklin D. Roosevelt lobbied hard against it. He called it a threat to national security. In 1938, the amendment came within just a few votes of passing in the House of Representatives. Then Hitler annexed Austria, Japan invaded China, and the world edged closer to chaos. The amendment died quietly in committee. America entered World War II without a referendum, and the Ludlow Amendment faded into a historical footnote, but its ghost lingers. It was a moment when the American people tried, desperately, to hold the brakes on the war machine. A brief flicker of direct democracy in the face of global madness, and in that flicker was a deep, aching truth. That once war begins, the people pay the price, even if they never cast the vote. And in the same decade, while Congress debated patriotism and war powers, another drama was unfolding. This time televised, explosive, and aimed at a man whose paranoia would eat him alive on camera. The McCarthy Army hearings, 1954. By 1954, Senator Joseph McCarthy was already a household name and a walking threat to civil liberties. He had spent years swinging accusations like a hammer, claiming that communists had infiltrated the U.S. government, the military, even Hollywood. Careers were ruined on mere suspicion. People lost jobs, reputations, futures, all without a shred of concrete evidence. His weapon of choice, the smear. His shield, fear. But in 1954, the hammer hit something too solid to break. The Army-McCarthy hearings began as a clash between McCarthy and the U.S. Army, which he accused of harboring communists. But what started as an investigation quickly turned into a televised bloodletting. For weeks, Americans watched live as McCarthy battled with Army Counsel Joseph Welch in a high-stakes showdown of rhetoric, rage, and reckoning. And then came the moment. After McCarthy needled a young lawyer from Welch's team, Welch finally snapped, "Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?" The words cut through the television like a blade. The courtroom fell silent. The public gasped. That moment didn't just end McCarthy's career. It detonated it. Within months, McCarthy was censured by the Senate. His approval ratings tanked. The Red Scare lost its teeth. The curtain had been pulled back, revealing not a patriot, but a bully powered by paranoia and enabled by silence. The hearings exposed the danger of unchecked power cloaked in patriotism. They reminded America that the Constitution is only as strong as the people willing to defend it, not with fear, but with principle. But McCarthyism wasn't an anomaly. It was part of a larger pattern, a web of surveillance, infiltration, and state-sponsored paranoia. And while McCarthy fell, the system that fed him didn't stop. It just went deeper underground. Operation Chaos, 1967-1974. If the CIA has a thou shalt not rule, it's this. Do not spy on Americans. Foreign threats only, no exceptions. But in the late 60s, rules were more like suggestions, especially when the counterculture exploded into full-blown rebellion. Enter Operation Chaos. Launched in 1967 under President Lyndon B. Johnson and later expanded by Richard Nixon, this covert CIA operation was designed to monitor the anti-war movement. Officially, its goal was to detect foreign influence, like Soviet support of student protests. Unofficially, it became a dragnet for domestic surveillance. The CIA infiltrated leftist organizations, bugged meetings, read mail, and compiled thousands of files on American citizens, without warrants, without probable cause, and without oversight. Peace activists, student leaders, journalists, black radicals, they all landed in the crosshairs. And Chaos wasn't alone. It operated in tandem with FBI's COINTELPRO and Army intelligence units. Together, these agencies waged a silent war against political dissenters, not terrorists, not saboteurs, citizens, protesters, critics. The operation ballooned in scope. By the time it ended, Chaos had files on over 7,000 individuals and 1,000 domestic organizations. Many had no connection to foreign entities whatsoever. It wasn't revealed until the Church Committee hearings in 1975, where a horrified public learned that the CIA had been operating like a domestic spy agency. Trust evaporated. Legislation followed. But the damage, to civil liberties, to democratic norms, to institutional integrity, was done. Operation Chaos showed just how easy it is to blur the line between protecting the nation and policing its conscience. When fear rules, ethics evaporate. And sometimes the enemy isn't foreign. It's an idea, a protest sign, a song lyric. And in the 1970s, fear took on many faces. Some wore suits, others wore ski masks, some had bombs, others had a manifesto, and a plan to make America listen by force. The Symbionese Liberation Army, SLA, 1970s. They called themselves the Symbionese Liberation Army, but they were less an army and more a chaotic theater troupe with automatic weapons and revolutionary delusions. In the fractured, volatile atmosphere of the 1970s, post-Vietnam, post-Watergate, mid-COINTELPRO, this group emerged as one of the most bizarre and violent manifestations of America's radical fringe. Formed in 1973, the SLA was a small, far-left urban guerrilla group with grand ambitions: overthrow capitalism, destroy the prison system, and ignite revolution. Their leader, Donald DeFreeze, who went by the alias Field Marshal Shinkway, was an escaped convict with a messianic complex. His followers, mostly white middle-class college radicals, believed they were on the front lines of a war against the state. But what put the SLA on the national radar was a kidnapping that blurred every line between victim and accomplice. In 1974, they abducted 19-year-old Patty Hearst, heiress to the Hearst media empire, from her Berkeley apartment. What followed defied logic. 2 months later, Hearst appeared in surveillance footage robbing a bank with the SLA. Gun in hand, calling herself Tanya. Was it Stockholm Syndrome? Brainwashing? Willful rebellion? The country was transfixed. The SLA's campaign was a surreal blend of radical politics, amateur militarism, and televised spectacle. They released manifestos on cassette tapes. They executed political enemies. They firebombed and robbed banks. Their ideology was incoherent, a mashup of black liberation rhetoric, Marxist jargon, and personal vendettas. In 1974, a botched police raid in Los Angeles ended with 6 SLA members dead in a house engulfed in flames. Patty Hearst was captured a year later and sentenced to prison, though her sentence was commuted by President Carter and she was later pardoned. The SLA was small, their impact disproportionate. They represented the extremes of 1970s radicalism, when protest gave way to bullets and the counterculture spun into violence. They left behind a legacy not of liberation, but of confusion, destruction, and cautionary headlines. But while the SLA was burning down safe houses, another group in Philadelphia was entering a prolonged, increasingly hostile standoff. one that would one day end with the roar of a police helicopter and fire raining from the sky. The MOVE organization and its confrontational history with Philadelphia police. Before the bombs, before the smoke rose above Osage Avenue, there were years of tension. Relentless, smoldering conflict between the MOVE organization and the city of Philadelphia. Founded in the early 1970s by John Africa, MOVE was more than a group. It was a belief system, a commune, a radical rejection of modern life. They advocated for natural living, rejected technology, opposed institutional control, and clashed loudly with the law. Their style was confrontational, their beliefs uncompromising. They were labeled anarchists, cultists, rebels. But MOVE saw themselves as warriors against a corrupt system. They condemned the police, the government, the media. They armed themselves, fortified their homes, and used bullhorns to broadcast their message day and night in residential neighborhoods. Their first deadly encounter with law enforcement came in 1978. After years of tension, police attempted to evict MOVE from their Powelton Village home. A gunfight erupted. One officer was killed. 9 MOVE members, later known as the MOVE 9, were convicted and sentenced to lengthy prison terms under highly controversial circumstances. The city saw MOVE as a problem to be eradicated, not understood, and the conflict only deepened. In the years that followed, MOVE relocated to Osage Avenue in West Philadelphia. Tensions flared again. Neighbors complained of unsanitary conditions, noise, and aggressive behavior. But instead of de-escalating, authorities prepared for war. It would culminate in 1985, when the city would make a catastrophic decision. But before the fire, before the aftermath, there was already a trail of blood, trial, and trauma, an ongoing battle that said more about institutional paranoia and urban neglect than about MOVE itself. That battle was about to reach its boiling point. The Green Scare, early 2000s. If you thought terrorism only wore a turban or carried a foreign passport, the early 2000s had a rebrand ready to go. This time, the enemy was domestic and green. Dubbed the Green Scare, this post-2001 wave of federal crackdown targeted radical environmental and animal rights activists with the same tools once used against foreign terrorists. The name itself was a play on the Red Scare, but instead of communists, the targets were Earth Firsters, ALF, Animal Liberation Front, and ELF, Earth Liberation Front, operatives, activists who use sabotage tactics to fight ecological destruction. Their crimes? Arson, property damage, and direct action aimed at companies they viewed as eco-criminals, logging operations, SUV dealerships, animal testing labs. No deaths, no injuries. But the FBI labeled them the #1 domestic terror threat. In response, the government unleashed sweeping indictments under the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act and other statutes. Activists were surveilled, infiltrated, and slapped with terrorism enhancements in sentencing. Some received longer prison terms than violent criminals. One infamous case, the Shack 7, a group of animal rights advocates convicted not for direct action, but for running a website that posted incendiary content. They didn't plant bombs, they posted addresses. The Green Scare exposed the blurry line between protest and terrorism in the post-2001 security state. It wasn't about whether the activists broke laws, they did. It was about proportionality and about fear. Environmentalism wasn't safe anymore. Activists found themselves labeled as threats simply for associating with radical groups or advocating civil disobedience. The chilling effect was real and deliberate. The Green Scare didn't just aim to stop property destruction. It aimed to silence a movement, and it proved that in the war on terror, even planting trees could get you labeled an enemy of the state. And speaking of enemies of the state, after 2001, America would take its gloves off. And what came next wasn't protest or sabotage, it was torture. Legalized, institutionalized, sanitized as enhanced. The use of enhanced interrogation techniques by the CIA, post-2001, after the Twin Towers fell and the Pentagon burned. America wasn't just hungry for justice, it wanted revenge. And in that fury, moral lines blurred. The result? A program that rewrote the rules of interrogation, then burned the original playbook. Dubbed enhanced interrogation techniques, this was the CIA's sanitized term for a suite of brutal methods used on detainees suspected of terrorism. Waterboarding, sleep deprivation, stress positions, rectal feeding, slamming prisoners against walls, confining them in coffin-sized boxes. All of it justified as necessary to prevent the next 2001. The legal foundation came from the Justice Department in the form of the now infamous torture memos. These documents argued that unless pain rose to the level of organ failure or death, it didn't legally qualify as torture. So the CIA took that legal green light and ran with it, right into the shadows. Dozens of detainees were subjected to these methods at black sites, secret prisons scattered across the globe. No trials, no charges, just indefinite detention and forced confessions. Some were innocent. Others held little to no valuable intelligence. But in the fog of war, guilt was assumed and brutality institutionalized. The Senate Intelligence Committee would later release a 6,000-page report, most of it still classified, confirming that the techniques were not only ineffective, but also lied about. The CIA exaggerated success, misrepresented results, hid facts from oversight bodies, and yet no one was held accountable. The architects of the program walked away. Some were even promoted. This wasn't just a policy. It was a rupture, a betrayal of American ideals. The land of the free had created a system that resembled its enemies more than its constitution. And the psychological damage on the tortured and the torturers was permanent. But the surveillance state didn't stop at the waterboard. As the digital age boomed, the government turned its eyes to the web. And the next betrayal wouldn't involve blood. It would involve your inbox. The PRISM surveillance program, 2007 present, revealed 2013. You were being watched. Not just suspected terrorists, not just foreign enemies, everyone. Your emails, your Google searches, your Facebook messages, even your Skype calls. All hoovered up and stored under the shadowy banner of national security. PRISM was the code name for a surveillance program run by the NSA, National Security Agency, launched in 2007 and revealed to the public in 2013 by whistleblower Edward Snowden. It allowed the U.S. government to collect data directly from the servers of major tech companies, Microsoft, Apple, Google, Yahoo, Facebook, and others, without users ever knowing. The program was justified under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, specifically Section 702, which was meant to target foreign nationals suspected of terrorism. But the dragnet didn't care about borders. American data got swept up too. Emails, chat logs, file transfers, video calls, all vacuumed into a secret, sprawling data center. Snowden's leak was a lightning bolt. The documents he released painted a picture of a surveillance state far beyond anything the public imagined. Secret courts, secret rulings, secret partnerships with corporations. The NSA wasn't just listening to the world. It was building the architecture for total information awareness. The backlash was immediate and global. Civil liberties advocates cried foul. International allies expressed outrage. Tech companies scrambled to reassure users. And Snowden? He fled to Hong Kong, then Russia, where he remains in exile. The U.S. government insisted the program was crucial to national security, that it stopped attacks, that it saved lives. But the details remained murky. Critics argued it was unconstitutional, overbroad, and prone to abuse. PRISM wasn't just a scandal, it was a shift. It exposed the costs of the post-2001 security apparatus. It showed how far the government would go, how much it would take, and how easily the Internet, the tool of liberation, could become a tool of control. And while PRISM was the digital betrayal, Flint was the analog. Pipes instead of programs. Poison instead of packets. A horror not from spies or soldiers, but from the city's own hands. The Flint, Michigan water crisis began 2014. This wasn't a third world disaster. It was Michigan. In 2014, the city of Flint, once a thriving hub of American industry, decided to change its water supply from the Detroit system to the Flint River. The reason? Cost cutting. The result? Mass poisoning. The river water was corrosive, highly, but the city, in its negligence, failed to add anti-corrosion chemicals to the supply. The result was catastrophic. Lead leached from aging pipes directly into household faucets. The water looked strange, tasted worse. Residents complained of rashes, hair loss, and foul-smelling showers. But they were ignored, over and over. Officials insisted everything was fine, even as pediatricians revealed elevated lead levels in children, even as researchers raised alarms, even as the water continued to corrode infrastructure and bodies alike. Emails later revealed the depth of the cover-up. Public officials dismissed evidence, manipulated data, mocked residents, blamed them, delayed action for months, then years. When bottled water finally came, it felt like charity for a man-made atrocity. The human toll? Staggering. Lead poisoning, especially in children, causes irreversible neurological damage. Behavioral issues, developmental delays, whole lives permanently altered. For what? To save a few $1 million. The Flint crisis was more than environmental. It was racial, economic, political. The city was majority black, deeply impoverished, and under state-appointed emergency management. Residents had no democratic say in the decision that poisoned them. Lawsuits followed. A few low-level indictments came, some resignations. But the outrage? It's still boiling. Like the water once did, full of toxins and betrayal. Flint wasn't just a failure of governance. It was an indictment of a system that sees some communities as disposable. That listens only when headlines force it to. That poisons, then forgets. And as the water turned brown in Flint, another moment would turn red, white, and blue, painted across the Capitol dome by flags, fists, and fury. The Capitol riot, January 6, 2021. It was supposed to be ceremonial. A box-checking day in the world's most resilient democracy. The Electoral College votes would be certified. The system would roll forward, bloodless and boring. But that's not what happened. On January 6, 2021, the Capitol was breached. Not by a foreign enemy, not by sleeper agents, but by fellow Americans. Fueled by election conspiracy theories, social media echo chambers, and direct incitement, thousands of rioters descended on Washington, D.C. Their mission? Stop the count. Take back the country. Hang Mike Pence. What began as a protest mutated into an insurrection. They stormed past barricades, beat police officers with flagpoles, erected gallows, smeared excrement in hallways, looted the Speaker's office. And for the first time since 1814, the U.S. Capitol was invaded, this time by people waving American flags. Lawmakers ducked for cover. Staffers hid under desks. Guns were drawn inside the chamber. Shots were fired. Blood was spilled. A Capitol police officer died from injuries. Several others died in the days that followed. The psychological toll ran deeper still. It was not just an attack on a building. It was an attack on legitimacy, on norms, on the story America tells itself, that power transfers peacefully, that facts matter, that the Constitution holds. On that day, the pillars shook. In the aftermath, hundreds were arrested. Many were live-streaming their crimes. Investigations exploded. The country split further. Some called it a coup attempt. Others called it tourism. And at the center of it all, a question America is still afraid to answer. What happens when democracy's enemies are born inside the house? But the Capitol riot wasn't the first time America buried truth. In fact, much of its history lies underground, literally. And what lies beneath is a quieter horror, decomposing in mass graves and unmarked earth. The use of mass graves for victims of early epidemics or disasters, before embalming, before morgues, before public health had a PR department, death came in floods, cholera, yellow fever, typhoid, plagues with no cure, no mercy, and nowhere to hide. And when they came, the bodies piled fast. Enter the mass grave. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, the United States coped with epidemic waves by digging trenches. Victims were buried quickly, often without ceremony or identification. There was no time, no space, and in truth, no plan for the poor, the immigrant, the outsider. In New York, during the cholera outbreaks of the 1830s and 1850s, Irish immigrants died in droves. Many were recent arrivals, crammed into disease-ridden tenements, working brutal jobs for starvation wages. When sickness came, they died anonymously and were buried just as anonymously. Their graves were rarely marked, their stories barely told. Disease, combined with poverty and prejudice, rendered them invisible. And this wasn't unique to Irish immigrants. In cities across the U.S., African Americans, Native Americans, Chinese laborers, any group deemed lesser, were more likely to end up in communal pits, not out of efficiency, out of disregard. The practice persisted well into the 20th century. From influenza to industrial disasters, mass graves remained the last refuge of those society failed twice, first in life, then in death. Even today, the legacy lingers. Hart Island in New York is one of the largest mass grave sites in the U.S., with over 1 million buried, many from marginalized communities. In death, as in life, segregation persisted. Mass graves are more than historical footnotes. They're evidence of systemic neglect, of institutional cruelty, of how crises reveal not just what kills, but who gets buried and who gets remembered. And with that, our descent ends, not in fire or bullets or scandal, but in soil, in the quiet, crowded earth, the most literal archive of America's darkest chapters. Because history isn't just written. Sometimes it's buried. And sometimes the worst thing isn't that we forget. It's that we never really looked in the first place.